The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall is magical. I mean that literally, it's a fantasy role-playing game with magic in it. Let's talk about that for a little while. This video will actually be a number of things: a deep dive into the mechanics of Daggerfall, an essay on game design, and the story of how I became the most powerful mage at Tamriel. The footage in the background will largely be a condensed and sped up full playthrough of Daggerfall. There are a few visual aids, but I'll let you know when to look back at the video in case you just have it on in the background. This video is long, so without further ado, let's meet our character. She'll be on screen. This is Girl with Book. Cursed by the gods for reasons unknown, Girl with Book was a sickly child, and, so displeased with her as they were, the divines forbade her from entering their sanctuaries for healing. Since she could not beseech the gods for aid, she was forced to turn to the arcane arts for relief. So, with the help of her father, a bookseller, she began studying the art of healing magic. She fell ill many times even after learning magic. She rarely had the strength to play with the other children, and when she did, they made fun of her for her frailty, even giving her the nickname Scrapper to mock her. Despite that, she tried to make friends, having the most success with the local booksellers, librarians, and mages. On her 12th birthday, the 14th of Frostfall, in the 397th year of the Third Era of Tamriel, the grand city of Snowhawk, her home, went under siege. That winter was very cold, even by Skyrim standards. While her life was spared from the ravages of war, her home was not, and neither was her father. From the burning wreckage of the bookshop, the only thing she could recover without succumbing to the flames herself was the first book she had ever read by herself. A copy of King Edward, Part 12. She's carried it with her to this day, its pages still stained with tears she shed huddled with the rest of the refugees on the road to Falkrenth. Once in Falkrenth, Girl with Book's fortunes improved, and she was adopted by a kind imperial family who also dealt in books. A few years later, her new family moved to the imperial city, and she followed them. She was sad to leave Skyrim, but eager to see new places. On the road to the imperial city, her family came upon a group of people being waylaid by highwaymen. Her adopted father was good with the blade, and she had learned some offensive magics as well, and between the two of them, the outlaws were run off. Girl with Book managed to heal the wounds of those injured. It turns out that these were family of the Emperor, and in exchange for her help, they offered Girl with Book a meeting with the Emperor. She accepted, of course. This is how she met the Emperor. Several years after that, the Emperor summoned her and asked her to go to the Iliac Bay to put the ghost of King Lysandus to rest, and to find a letter he had sent that never arrived. As she was nearing Daggerfall, a supernatural and malefic storm destroyed the ship she was on, and she was thrown overboard, washing ashore in a cave. As she washed up in Privateer's hold, she found that her spellbook was mostly destroyed, leaving her with only a few spells at her disposal. It was a challenge to survive in the horrible place, but she managed to make it out of there alive and well. It was almost certainly all luck. When she got into the nearby town of Gothway Garden, she took out a loan to refill her book with some spells, as these 3 were not sufficient for her. Somehow, her copy of King Edward Part 12 was spared, however, and while she knew it could fetch some good coin, she couldn't bear to part with it. Girl with Book joined the Mages Guild to get some spells in her spellbook, as well as to get some tutoring. In order to pay back her loan and pay for training, she decided to take up some courier work for the guild, fetching research notes from scholars throughout the kingdom of Daggerfall. While there was some danger from the necromancers who wanted the classified research notes, she knew that she'd be safe on the way back with the notes due to the recall spell she just bought. And if she ran into any trouble on the way to fetch the notes, a chameleon spell would help her sneak past it. Now that Girl with Book has some new spells in her spellbook, let's talk about how spells work in this game. I want to make it clear that I am not a code rat, so the information I'm giving here is based off of what I've been able to learn without diving into the code. There will be one referenced code later on, but that will be the only thing I can be 100% sure of. Firstly, there are 2 types of spells in this game. There are Cercinate spells, the pre-made ones that Bethesda created. You can purchase these from the Mages Guild without even being a member of the guild. Then there are also spells that the player makes through the spell-making system. I'll be referring to these as custom spells. A spell will have a few properties. It has a name, as well as an icon that represents it on your screen while the spell is active, and a spell point cost. A spell also has a delivery mode. By default, the delivery mode is caster only, but this changes to by touch if you add any hostile elements. After that are single target at range, area around caster, and area at range. It is important to remember that the spell itself is what has the delivery mode options, which makes mixing defensive and offensive spell effects useless. The spell will also have one of the 5 elements associated with it: fire, frost, shock, poison, or magicka, the default being magicka. Most importantly, though, a spell has spell effects. A spell can have up to 3 spell effects. All but 2 Cercinate spells have only a single spell effect, however. We will be going over each and every spell effect later, but for now, all you need to know is that these effects describe what the spell does. Spell effects are defined by 3 properties: chance, duration, and magnitude. Not every spell effect has all 3 of these properties. For example, Paralyze has chance of success and duration, but no magnitude, as an enemy will either be fully paralyzed or not at all. Chance is short for chance of success. The total chance of a spell effect will be defined as such: x plus y per z levels. For example, the Cure Poison effect attached to the Cercinate spell Belina's Antidote is defined as follows: 15 plus 5 per 1 level. Thus, if a level 3 character casts Belina's Antidote, their chance of successfully curing a poison would be 30%. Duration is measured with in-game rounds, each being an in-game minute, about 5 real-life seconds. It is defined in the same way as chance of success, x plus y per z levels. For example, the water walking effect of the Cercinate spell, Water Walking, is defined as follows: 5 plus 2 per 1 level. Thus, if a level 3 character casts Water Walking, the spell will last 11 rounds, or about 55 seconds. Magnitude is a catch-all for any spell effect that has a number value associated with it, say damage. It is defined only a little bit differently from chance and duration, as each of x and y are defined as a number range instead of just a single number. For example, the damage health effect of Ice Bolt is defined as follows: 1 to 35 plus 1 to 5 per 1 level. Thus, if a level 3 character casts Ice Bolt, it will deal anywhere between 4 and 50 damage, that is a range of 1 to 35, plus 3 instances of 1 to 5. Each spell effect will belong to one of the 6 schools of magic. The spell itself will belong to any and all schools of the spell effects it contains. If you hypothetically created a spell with effects from 3 different schools, casting that spell will advance your skill in all 3 of those schools. Along with the overall power of an effect, determined by its chance, duration, and/or magnitude, your skill with a school of magic and the spell's delivery mode will both determine the spell point cost of a spell effect belonging to that skill. On screen will be a demonstration with a test character. This test character purchased a few spells, namely Force Bolt and Sphere of Annihilation. I chose Force Bolt because it is one of the 2 Cercinate spells that has 2 spell effects, and I chose Sphere of Annihilation simply because it was the most expensive Cercinate destruction spell. Here, the character has 25% in destruction and 25% in alteration. Note the costs of these 2 spells. This character also, through the Spellmaker, purchased the damage portion of Force Bolt and the paralyze portion of Force Bolt, each as separate spells. I also made a copy of Force Bolt where the effects are listed in the opposite order to see if that had any bearing on the spell itself. Now, the character has 50% in destruction and 25% in alteration. You can see that the costs of the destruction spells have decreased significantly. You can also see that the cost of Force Bolt and the version where the effects are listed in the opposite order remain the same cost. Now, the character has 75% in destruction and 25% in alteration. Again, the costs of these spells are lower. It's also important to note here that the cost of Force Bolt has consistently been exactly the sum of both of its parts. Now, the character has 100% in destruction and 25% in alteration. We can see the full discount from the highest skill level in effect. Sphere of Negation, which once cost a massive 598 spell points at 25% destruction, now costs only 70 at 100%. The damage portion of Force Bolt has now become an eminently reasonable cost of 16 spell points. Now the character has 100% in destruction and 50% in alteration. We can see that now the paralysis portion of Force Bolt is decreasing, and the Force Bolt spell itself is decreasing at the same rate. All of this is to say that each spell effect within a spell has its own cost that is calculated, and that it is the sum of all of these costs which are added together to find the cost of the spell. The spell's cost is not affected by the order in which the spell effects are listed, nor is it affected by which school to which the most expensive effect belongs. It is also not affected by the number of spell effects in it. It is only a simple summation of costs. The summation might get a little finicky though with low cost spell effects. The minimum spell point cost of any spell is 5 spell points. If you were to make a spell with a spell effect that should only cost you 2 spell points, the spell will still cost you 5. If you ran a similar experiment to the one I just showed off with less expensive spell effects, you might run into a situation wherein your destruction spell cost 5, your alteration spell cost 23, and your force bolt alike spell only costs 26, which wouldn't be a simple summation. The minimum cost of spells would be the culprit behind that hypothetical discrepancy. In the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, the system changes a bit. In Morrowind, I do believe that the total spell point cost of the spell is a summation of all of its effects, like in Daggerfall, but spells can only belong to one school, even if it contains effects which belong to multiple different schools. I don't want to go too far into the mechanics of that game, but long story short, the spell generally takes the school of the most powerful effect it contains. Casting the spell will only advance your skill in one school of magic. I think that both approaches are reasonable, but I think that Daggerfalls makes more intuitive sense, at least to me. If you're going to break magic down into schools, it makes sense to me that a spell which has effects from different schools would belong to all of the schools. Casting a spell that belongs to multiple schools seems like it should advance all of the relevant skills, not just the one that is being used more. And if a spell belongs to all of those schools, your skill with all of those schools should be taken into account. Perhaps a way to meet in the middle of these two different approaches would be something like this. You rank each of the spell effects by the percentage of the total spell point cost they contribute. Say a restoration effect contributes 35% of the spell's spell point cost. Then perhaps your restoration skill would have full effectiveness on that 35% of the cost of the spell, and when you cast that spell, your restoration skill would be advanced at 35% of the normal rate, whatever that normal rate is. Spell making is interesting in video games and not something that I see explored very often. Most games that have spells don't have spell making, and most of those that do are based fully around the concept. An example that comes to mind is Magicka. There aren't many games that simply include spellmaking as a game mechanic. In most games with spellmaking, a player simply chooses the elements involved in the spell. Rarely do they have any control over the actual power of the spell like they do in the Elder Scrolls. Furthermore, in most games with spellmaking, a spell created identically on two different characters will behave identically on both of those characters. Whereas in Daggerfall, because each spell effect is calculated based on its skill independently, two different characters could make the same spell, and it would cost slightly different amounts, and in Morrowind it would have a different spell cast chance. This is a mechanic that gives the player a lot more freedom than is usually provided by role-playing games. It opens up so many implications, both for role-playing and storytelling potential, as well as interesting mechanical choices. It's also something that is incredibly difficult to balance, and very often results in circumstances unforeseen by the developers. Game balance in single-player games is a bit of a weird topic to talk about. In some ways, game balance shouldn't matter too much, as players are free to self-regulate. In other ways, game balance is important because players who unintentionally choose underpowered options may find themselves having less fun than they would have otherwise, as players generally want to feel like their character is at least competent and reasonably powerful. Generally, I think there are two ways to balance video games. The first way is to balance by numbers. Going with a very math and number heavy approach can be beneficial if game balance is a priority, but doing so comes with a risk. If you make various numbers have too much parity, the distinction between them can get lost, and you risk losing a lot of the flavor, which, for a role playing game, is key. If, for example, a magic spell does just about the same amount of damage as an arrow from a bow, why use your spell points for damage when you could conserve that resource for something else? The second way to balance a game is much less precise. It also requires a lot of playtesting, making it the harder way to balance a game, but I would argue that this is the way that developers of role playing games should balance their game, and that is by vibes. Just play the game more and see what feels right. See if magic, and anything else really, feels good to use. I know that that's a pretty unsatisfactory place to leave that, but I promise I will get back to this point later. Aside from game balance, we also have the issue of spellmaking creating circumstances unforeseen by the developers, and like game balance, I see two ways of going about this as well. The first way is to limit player options. If the player has fewer options, the developers can test a larger proportion of the options a player can make. I think that this is obviously a pretty suboptimal solution to this problem. It can likely be assumed that the reason a spellmaking mechanic would exist is expressly for the purpose of increasing player choice, so taking this approach is counterproductive. The second way of dealing with this problem is to do nothing. Allow the players to get themselves into a scenario that you, as the developer, couldn't foresee, and trust that they'll be able to get themselves out of it. Allow the players to have these tools and to make use of them as they see fit. I can't help but draw a comparison to another Elder Scrolls game, this time the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, and actually again to Morrowind as well. In Oblivion, the developers removed levitation spells from the game. I can't say for sure which came first, but it is also the case that the game world as it exists would not work with levitation in the game. Cities in Oblivion are their own isolated spaces, cut off from the open world at large, accessible only through the city gates along the walls. If a player were to attempt to levitate over the city walls, they would be met with a barren copy of the city that was never meant to really be seen. Morrowind actually has the same problem, though not in the base game. In the Tribunal expansion, the entire story takes place in the city of Mournhold, a single walled city. If you were to levitate over the walls, you'd find that the city is located in the middle of a vast ocean with nothing around it for miles. And so the levitation spell effect simply doesn't work in Mournhold. You get a little message at the bottom of the screen saying as much if you attempt to use it. I am pretty sure that what happened here in both of these cases is that the developers of these games built a world and then realized that the world would fall apart with levitation magic. So rather than work around that, they simply removed the problem. I think that the lesson to be learned here is that if you're going to have magic in the game, you need to design the game around it, and I'll be coming back to this point a bit later as well. I think that the way spells work in games is really interesting. Spells allow for a lot of interesting and complex mechanics, and that's great. That's why we play games after all. Spell making is an incredible tool, not just for those mechanics, but also as a tool for player creativity and expression. But anyway, now that we know how these spell things work, let's get back to the one casting them. Right after her first courier job, Girl with Book received a letter from Brissiena, Lady Magnessa, an agent of the Emperor in the Iliac Bay. The shock from her boat going down had almost caused Girl with Book to forget what she was doing in this land to begin with. She met with Lady Magnesson to get rebriefed on the situation. Years ago, King Lysandus of Daggerfall died on the field of battle, but his spirit does not rest. A spectral army descends upon the city of Daggerfall every night, and Lysandus can be heard howling for revenge. Girl with Book was tasked with putting Lysandus to rest, as well as finding the Emperor's letter, which never arrived. After meeting with Brissiena, she went back to doing courier work for the Mages Guild and practicing her skills. After a few weeks, Girl with Book got a letter from Morgaya, Princess of Wayrest, but she wasn't quite assured of her position in the Iliac Bay quite yet, especially when it came to potentially dangerous matters. So, to test her competence, she took on a more difficult job for the Mages Guild, going into a dungeon in search of a rare ingredient. She delved into the citadel of Gaersley and fought a great many giant rats, as well as some people, likely outlaws, who had holed up there. It took her many days, as she found her magical power heavily taxed and had to rest often. She managed to find the Daedra heart that the Mages Guild asked her to retrieve, but as she recalled to safety, she knew that this success was a fluke. If she wanted to be the hand of the Emperor, she'd need to be more skillful as well as more prepared. And so, after yet again running errands and practicing her skills, Girl with Book decided to delve into yet another dungeon. She once again fought hard, but her power was simply insufficient, and she yet again recalled to safety, this time in abject failure. She apologized to the guild and decided to move on, traveling to Anticlare. She found herself in the small town of Bale Market and took a liking to the place. Girl with Book, in her failure, knew that she needed to think of something else, another way to keep herself safe in these horrible dungeons. She had a fine walking stick that the Emperor had given to her, a beautiful thing of fine ash wood inlaid with silver. While she was loath to use such a thing as a weapon, she knew that if she were in danger again, and unable to call upon her magical power, it could be the difference between life and death. There was a guild of fighters in Bale Market, and Girl with Book knew that they would offer training in the martial arts, such as the use of a staff as a weapon. She also knew, however, that the guild wouldn't let her in, as weak as she was and as unskilled as she was. But she wasn't going to let that stop her, so she devised a clever ruse. Surely the Fighters Guild wouldn't know enough about magic to detect it, so she took a cloth amulet and enchanted it to increase her skill with staves. A simple strip of cloth wouldn't be able to hold an enchantment that powerful by itself, and so she used some darker magics to fortify it. This rendered it, like her, forbidden from holy places. She didn't suspect anyone else would get much use of the item, and this wasn't a bane to her. Alas, the Fighters Guild did see through the ruse, seeing her sorcery for what it was. While this upset Girl with Book, she understood, and hoped that the amulet alone would provide enough help to her. Enchanting is one hell of a thing in Daggerfall. I'm not going to be beating around the bush here. Making your own custom magical items is easily the most powerful thing any character can do in this game. I also really like the way the mechanics here are implemented. You can create your own magical items as a high-ranking member of either the Mages Guild or the Temple of Julianos. I'll be referring to this process as enchanting, I'll be referring to the items made through this process as custom items, and I'll be referring to the dialogue you go through to make custom items as the enchanting menu. Each item has an intrinsic enchantment point budget. The budget here defines how many powers the items can be enchanted with. For example, the cloth amulet that Girl with Book used has an enchantment point budget of 600 points. Each power you add to the item increases the amount of enchantment points you are using from that budget. For example, the Enhances Skill Blunt Weapon power uses 900 enchantment points. That pushes us above the budget that the cloth amulet allows, so we can't just add that power, we have to get back within the budget. The way we do that is with side effects. Much like powers, side effects also have an enchantment point value associated with them, except this value is subtracted from the amount of enchantment points you are using from your budget. In the case of the cloth amulet, Girl with Book added the side effect Item Deteriorates in Holy Places, which subtracted 500 from the enchantment points being used. 900 from the enhanced skill power minus 500 from the side effect means that Girl with Book ended up using 400 points of the 600 point budget. The cost in gold of enchanting is going to be the total value of all the powers the item has times 10. This does not take into account any side effects, so for example, the cloth amulet that Girl with Book made here had 900 points worth of powers. Despite the 500 points being subtracted by the side effect and the amulet only ending up using 400 of its 600 point budget, the price of the item was still 9,000 gold. You can enchant an item with up to 10 powers and side effects in total. When you are happy with the suite of powers and side effects, you can give the item its own name, which is fantastic for role-playing and storytelling. We are going to go over all of the powers and side effects that you can add to a custom item. Let's start with the powers and then move on to the side effects. One suite of powers that you can add to an enchanted item is the casting of a Cercinate spell. Almost all of the Cercinate spells are available, though there are several exceptions, namely Belina's Balm, Banish Daedra, Buoyancy, Calm Humanoid, Charm Mortal, Cure Disease, Fenric's Door Jam, Frostbite, Holy Touch, Holy Word, Jumping, Null Magica, Sleep, Soul Trap, Spider Touch, Quiet Undead, and Tame. There are 3 ways in which a spell can be cast from a magic item. The simplest is cast on use. You use the item through the Use Magic Item menu, and you cast the spell. Secondly, there is cast while held, which essentially makes it constantly recast the spell with no downtime while the item is equipped. Thirdly, there is casts when strikes, which applies only to weapons. When you hit an enemy with the weapon, it automatically casts the spell on that enemy. Interestingly, there are a few different Cercinate spells that are available for multiple casting modes here. For example, Levitate and Troll's Blood can both be cast either when used or when held, and Ice Bolt and Wizard's Fire can be cast when used or on strike. This is a good amount of flexibility and good to suit different playstyles. I, for example, would rarely want an item with casts when held if I could have it cast when used, but many others might prefer the convenience of casts when held. You can find random magic items as loot, and you can purchase them from the Mages Guild. All of these random magic items are ones which cast a Cercinate spell in one of the three casting modes, with the exception of two. Bear with me a moment, we'll get back to that shortly. Random magic items you didn't purchase start out as unidentified, meaning that you cannot see its magical effects, though you can use magical items which you have not identified. Each enchantment comes with an affix that describes what the enchantment does, such as Longsword of Oblivion or Shirt of Fortitude, describing that the longsword casts Sphere of Negation on strike and the shirt casts Fortitude when held. The affix is only revealed once you get the item identified. While you can get plenty of magic items that cast Cercinate spells, having the ability to make your own allows you to consistently acquire items of a specific spell if you want, say, items that cast the open spell for you. It also allows you to make an item that casts two or more spells. Say you want an item that casts both heal and stamina when you use it, so you can recover hit points as well as fatigue. Magical items that cast Cercinate spells will end up deteriorating as they are used, reducing their condition until the item eventually breaks. By default, magical items cannot be repaired. A magical item that casts when used will deteriorate whenever you use it to cast a spell. Magical items that cast when held deteriorate passively as long as they are held. And magical items that cast on strike will deteriorate whenever they are used to strike an enemy. This makes putting a lot of spells onto one custom item an interesting proposition, as the more spells you put on it, the more powerful it is, yes, but also the more expensive it is, and the more expensive it will be to replace when it inevitably breaks. Casting a spell through a magic item that casts on use actually advances your skill in the relevant school of magic as though you cast the spell yourself. However, casting spells when held or on strike does not advance the appropriate magic skill. This makes enchanted items that cast spells on use very useful for training the magic skills of characters with low spell point totals. I find the implications of enchanted items advancing your skills rather interesting. In Morrowind, there is an entire skill dedicated to using enchanted items, the Enchant skill. And I think that that is also very interesting. It allows two sorts of character fantasy. The first, provided by Daggerfall, is the idea of a specialist in a single school of magic who uses highly specialized arcane implements to aid them. The second, provided by Morrowind, is that of a master enchanter, an artificer, whose specialty is magic items themselves, including the creation and maintenance of them. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim offers yet another sort of fantasy. See, in Skyrim, enchanting changes up quite a bit from its predecessors. Listen up, Skyrim heads, I'm actually going to compliment this game here. A little bit. In Morrowind, when you enchant an item, you essentially add a spell to it. In Skyrim, enchantments are their own distinct things. Your character simply knows a certain number of distinct enchantments that you can apply to your items while enchanting. You learn new enchantments by disenchanting items, destroying them, and learning their magical properties. I love the idea of the Skyrim enchanter, searching the land for new enchantments to learn, scouring libraries for formulae, and spending uncountable hours in the laboratory, hunched over the enchanting table. Unfortunately, that's where the complimenting ends, as there are plenty of problems with the way enchanting is implemented in Skyrim. Most games that I've played are very boring when it comes to enchanting items. You enchant an item with a specific enchantment that gives a specific benefit, say plus 5 fire damage or plus 20 hit points. Sometimes there are minor differences depending on what kind of item you are enchanting, say chest piece enchantments being more powerful than glove enchantments. An item can usually only have one enchantment. Sometimes you can replace an enchantment with a new one, sometimes you cannot. And the enchantment generally gives you only a minor statistical advantage, but will not change the way you play in a major way. Fundamentally, this is how the enchantment works in Skyrim as well. I think that this is really unfortunate for a few reasons. Firstly, it's just a shame that a franchise with a history of more unique enchanting mechanics like the Elder Scrolls, like in Daggerfall and Morrowind, has chosen to implement a system that is much more like most other games. Things being unique doesn't necessarily make them good, of course, but the systems in Daggerfall and Morrowind are not bad. Unbalanced, yes, but definitely not bad. I think that it's a bad idea to throw away a system that is both unique and good. Secondly, in Daggerfall you have the option to add other powers and side effects to an item, allowing for more options. In Morrowind you control the numbers involved with whatever spells go on an item. In Skyrim, you select the enchantment, and that's it. Technically, with weapon enchantments, you do get a choice on how much damage you want the enchantment to do, with less damage getting you more uses before you need to recharge the item. But other than that, there is no decision making after adding the enchantment to the item. This is very stifling for player choice when you consider that this sort of mechanic is supposed to promote player choice. This is presumably supposed to be a system that allows more creative expression from the player, but there's nothing creative about wanting to enchant your armor to resist magic and selecting the resist magic option in a menu and being done with it. And thirdly, I am disappointed with enchantment coming down to simple statistical improvements. I think making number go up is always a fine thing to do. I don't mind that. But when that is all that enchantment is, where's the magic there? Enchanting should open up new opportunities to the player, not just make your boots give you extra carry capacity. This is a point I'll come back to later. Remember when I said that all the random magic items were ones that just cast Cercinate spells except for two? Let's talk about the other two effects now. One of the random magic item types has the effect of enhances skill for the dragonish skill. It will either be an item of leaping or of venom spitting, depending on what version of the game you're playing. Originally, items of venom spitting were levitation items, and items of leaping were the dragonish enhancing items, but there's a patch that switches the affixes, which is automatically enabled by Daggerfall Unity. The Enhances Skill enchantment costs 900 enchantment points in the enchanting menu. This grants a plus 15% bonus to the skill in question. It acts while the item is equipped, and the item does not deteriorate for this bonus. You can select any skill when enchanting an item with this power. While you can have multiple instances of Enhances Skill on one item, you cannot select the same skill more than once on a single item. You can, however, have multiple different items increasing the same skill. This is clearly an effect that has a broad use case. If, like Girl with Book, you want to shore up a lack of combat abilities, getting an extra 15% in a weapon skill can make a huge impact. Since the casting cost of spells is based on your skill with the relevant schools, getting 15% in a magic skill can extend your spell point pool by a decent margin. Even simply enhancing your running skill to move around a bit faster can be worth it. A funny thing that I thought to test was enhancing the hand-to-hand skill. As the hand-to-hand skill influences the damage of unarmed attacks, unlike other weapon skills, I wanted to see how high you could get it. While technically you can have up to 23 enchanted items equipped, if you filled all 23 slots, you wouldn't have a free hand to make unarmed attacks with. So the maximum hand-to-hand skill you can use is 460%, granting you a damage range of 47 to 93. That's 330% from 22 enchanted items, giving 15% each, 100% from maximizing the skill, and 30% from being a lycanthrope or vampire. I ran around a little bit in a dungeon, and I don't think I had to punch anybody more than once. It was pretty goofy. As Girl with Book and I found out, enhancing a skill with magic items does not allow you to qualify for faction entrance or promotion. In addition, if your skill goes over 100% due to the enchantment, you can continue to advance it through use as you would if it were not being magically enhanced. The other type of magic item that can be found randomly is an item of magicka. It has the power absorbs spells. Importantly, this is not a cast when used nor when held spell absorption. This is a distinct effect that also allows you to absorb spells. Absorbs spells cost 1500 enchantment points in the enchanting menu and works while the item is equipped. 1500 is less than the cost of casts when held spell absorption, which costs 1720 points. Importantly, it does not drain any item condition for being equipped, nor for successfully absorbing a spell. This makes the absorbed spell's power strictly more powerful than casts when held spell absorption. Spell absorption is a pretty powerful effect, and it is especially valuable when combined with the next power I'm going to be talking about. We'll be talking more about it later when I go over all the spell effects, but suffice it to say, when you're hit with a spell, you might absorb it, nullifying the effects and restoring your spell points. Now we're going to move on to the other powers you can access while enchanting. None of these powers cause the item to deteriorate, and they all work while the item is equipped unless stated otherwise. The next power you can add to a custom item is extra spell points. This gives you an extra 75 spell points if a criterion is met. There are several different criteria you can choose when you select the option. 4 of the criteria are during season. Each of autumn, spring, summer, and winter cost 500 enchantment points. The next 3 criteria are during lunar phase. Full, half, and new moon all cost 200 points each in the enchanting menu. Having the extra spell points tied to the lunar phase is really interesting, and I wasn't sure how it worked exactly, so I tested it. I made a character and item that had each of the 3 phases selected, and here are my results. I didn't take footage of this test, but the results are on screen here. The lunar cycle lasts 32 days, and there are 2 moons offset by 4 days from each other. In this 32-day cycle, if you have an item enchanted in this way, you will receive no extra spell points for 10 days, interspersed throughout the cycle. Very interestingly, for 1 day in this cycle, you actually get 2 sets of 75 spell points for an extra 150. There isn't a run of more than 3 days where you don't get your spell points. Choosing all 4 seasons at 500 points each would cost you 2,000 enchantment points in order to achieve a constant plus 75 spell points. Choosing each of the 3 lunar phases at 200 points each on the other paw would cost 600 enchantment points and give you your plus 75 spell points about 2/3 of the time, as well as the 1 in 32 day 150 spell points. This is much more efficient when it comes to enchantment point to spell point ratio, but is also not consistent, and would require you to either be willing to not receive any benefit from your enchantment on occasion, or keep track of the lunar cycle. Rats are generally pretty smart, but I am an exception to that rule, so keeping track of the lunar cycle would take up far too much mental bandwidth for me to personally consider doing, but I could be okay with accepting the magic item being turned off every once in a while. The last 4 criteria for the extra spell points power is being near a specific enemy type. Unlike the seasons and lunar phases, the enchantment point cost is different for each enemy type. It costs 700 points for undead, 800 for Daedra, 900 for humanoids, and 1000 for animals. The extra spell points you get are added to your maximum spell points, but not your current spell points. So when you walk near the enemy type, it will look like you lose spell points. This property, though, is why I said that spell absorption is so powerful in conjunction with the extra spell points power. Because you can only absorb spells, if you could regain all of the spell points from the spell, this gives you a buffer for that. Say you have an item enchanted with extra spell points near undead. You might be going through a dungeon and coming into contact with a vampire ancient. This would cause your maximum spell points to go up, so when the vampire casts a spell at you, you would have an extra buffer against it with spell absorption. As is evidenced by occasionally receiving 150 spell points from the item with all 3 extra spell points lunar phase powers, all of these powers are checked independently. In theory, if you were in the correct place in the lunar cycle, during the proper season, and near all 4 enemy types, a single item could give you 525 spell points, although the chance of this happening in normal gameplay is certainly very near 0. Additionally, you can receive these points from any number of items equipped with these powers. Hypothetically, if I'm not missing anything, you could have 23 items enchanted with these powers, granting you 12,075 spell points. This is obviously absurd, but it's pretty fun. The next power that you can put on custom items is much simpler than the last. Featherweight costs 100 enchantment points. It makes the item weigh 1/4 of a kilogram regardless of the item's original weight. I like putting this on specifically the chest piece and tower shields, as those are the heaviest things you can wear. If your character has particularly low strength, you could significantly increase your effective carry weight by putting this power on all of your armor pieces. Next, we have good rep with. For 1,000 enchantment points, you can choose one of the 5 social classes, nobles, scholars, merchants, commoners, or the underworld, and increase your reputation with them. Or, for 5,000 points, you can choose all 5 of them. This is important because remember, you can only have a total of 10 powers and side effects, so this saves you on slots. Personally, I've never found reputation of much importance in Daggerfall, but it can influence your ability to continue the main quest, as quest givers might not talk to you if you have low reputation for whatever reason. You can feel free to throw this on an item if you need it, but outside of mechanical benefit, the idea that you can somehow enchant an item to make everyone like you more is interesting from a storytelling perspective. I have to wonder how it works. Is this a moral thing to do? Wouldn't you be using magic to influence people's minds? Or is there something else going on? There are three special advantages that you can take in the class maker at the beginning of the game that can be improved by the Improves Talents item power. These advantages are Acute Hearing, Adrenaline Rush, and Athleticism. Improves Talents Hearing costs 500 enchantment points, and the other two cost 600. The functions of all three of these class advantages are unclear in Classic, but the Unity recreation ensures a given function for each, so I'll be going with those. Acute Hearing, by default, increases the range you can hear enemy barks by 25%. The power increases the range to plus 50%. Adrenaline Rush, by default, improves your armor class and to hit by 5 at low health values. The power increases the bonus to 8. Athleticism decreases the rate at which you lose fatigue and increases your jump height by 10% each. The power increases this to 20%. I think that athleticism is pretty good, as I often run into issues with fatigue, and I'm especially afraid of running out of it when there are enemies that damage it nearby. Doubling its effectiveness is nice and well worth the gold. I find that the other two talents are not all that valuable, unfortunately. I think that this is a particularly neat power. I get that essentially all magic in some way enhances your abilities, but the idea that there are enchantments that empower specific talents that not all people have is really interesting to me. Who knows what other enchantments might exist in the world of the Elder Scrolls that we simply never see because it isn't useful for adventurers or is otherwise outside of the scope of the games. Maybe there's an enchantment to improve someone's sense of smell or their language acquisition skills. Which brings us to today's sponsor. Nah, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, this is the sort of thing that gets my mind to buzz. I just love it. Although in retrospect, language skills are in this particular game, so maybe that example isn't the best. Now we have one of the more useful powers, well worth purchasing on any character that has access to enchanting. Increased weight allowance offers either 25 or 50% additional carry weight for 400 or 600 enchantment points. You cannot get the benefit of multiple instances of this power, and the stronger version overwrites the weaker version. I think that this is just really great. It's a power that any character can appreciate. A small, weak character would love to have this to allow them to wear more and heavier armor, and a strong character will always be happy to carry more loot. And I really like that this is a carry weight increase and not a strength increase. Strength, while it determines carry weight capacity, does more than just that. I like the ability to target specific things rather than broad categories, and I think that this is a good example of that. Next, we have Potent versus Undead, Daedra, Humanoids, or Animals. This is one that you can only put on weapons, as it increases damage dealt versus a chosen enemy type. Again, the four enemy types have different enchantment point costs for each. Those are Undead for 800 points, Daedra for 900, Humanoids for 1000, and Animals for 1200. The ideas rush into my mind. Elven longbow of beast slaying, dwarven mace of skeleton smashing, ebony war axe of banishing. The fantasy of this power is absolutely on point. I love this as a flavorful addition, but unfortunately I do not think it is worth it mechanically. This power suffers from really poor pricing. Undead, Daedra, and humanoids are all much more powerful on average than animals are, and yet the bonus damage versus animals is the most expensive option. Dealing extra damage to animals should be a fundamentally low-level option because animals are fundamentally low-level foes. Making it cost you 12,000 gold by itself is unreasonable for low-level characters. But beyond that, you're enchanting a weapon with this property. If you have a good skill with weapons, your chance to hit will be reasonable, which means that you won't miss very often. If you don't miss when you make attacks, you'll be doing damage. I just don't think that adding a bit of damage is all that significant, unless you're playing a weapon-using character with low speed, in which case I suppose a bit of extra damage would help. Up next, we have Regen's Health. This is a power that makes you, well, regenerate health. 1 hit point per 4 in-game minutes, about 20 real seconds. You can gain health regeneration from multiple equipped items, and you receive these hit points all at the same time, regardless of when exactly you equip each item. This probably will never matter, but it could. You can choose either in sunlight or in darkness for 3,000 enchantment points, or all the time for 4,000 points. We should probably talk about the discrepancy between sunlight and darkness in Daggerfall. In addition to this enchantment power, there are a couple of other effects that can be on in sunlight or in darkness. Outside, sunlight occurs for half of the time, and darkness the other half. That makes sense. The problem is that indoors is always considered dark, I guess because you aren't in actual sunlight, even if there are clearly lights near you. Most of the time, I'd imagine people only very rarely encounter enemies outside, and if they do, it'd probably be nighttime. There are plenty of quests that can spawn enemies at you while you're outside, so it is far from impossible to run into enemies outside during the daytime, but most of the time when you do, it's only going to be a few. And if it's only a few enemies, you probably don't need the help from magical items to deal with them. I consider these effects that trigger in daylight almost completely worthless. Maybe that is too harsh, and it is certainly influenced by my personal playstyle, but that's just how I see it. I would consider getting regen's health in darkness on a few items, but I can't see myself spending the extra 10,000 gold for changing it to regen all the time. Repairs objects is the next power. It costs 900 enchantment points while enchanting. This power repairs damaged items you have equipped and in your inventory. This effect stacks with multiple such items equipped. Now, as I've said, you cannot repair magic items by default, and this is not an exception to that rule. If, however, you enable repairing magic items, this effect will repair magic items over time. I think that this is pretty fun. I like utility magic like this. I like it when there are options that don't directly impact your character's power level, and I think games should always have those sorts of options. Repair bills for high quality weapons and armor can also get pretty expensive, so beyond the convenience factor of having a magic item do it for you, you can also save a bit of gold by having a custom item with this power in the late game. Now, strengthens armor, another easy one. It costs 700 enchantment points and increases your armor class on all body locations by 5. It doesn't stack with multiple instances of this enchantment on custom items. This effect is mechanically solid, though mechanically boring. A bit of extra armor class is good to have, but doesn't significantly change the game. Fantasy is filled with this sort of thing: shield spells, mage armor, arcane wards, all sorts of protective things like that. In Dungeons and Dragons, I've always loved abjurers, and they're pretty consistently my favorite wizard archetype. I love the protective spells, and this fits right into that fantasy. Like I said, it is mechanically uninteresting, but extra armor is good, and it's a big win on flavor. It's also only 7,000 gold, which isn't too bad in the mid-game. And finally, we have a Vampiric Effect, either at range or when strikes. Vampiric Effect at range costs 2,000 enchantment points and drains hit points from enemies in melee range passively and transfers them to you. However, much like the regen's health power, this effect happens only once every 20 seconds or so, and it seems to only steal 1 hit point. This means that if you had 20 items with this enchantment equipped at the same time, you would steal an average of 1 hit point per second. But the cost of that is that it only steals from enemies in melee range. An enemy in melee range is attacking you and dealing damage to you. And at the levels it would take to get enough money for so many of these custom items with this power, the enemy is dealing a lot of damage, probably more than 20 per second. Vampiric Effect at range seems wildly unreliable as well. Because it only triggers every 20 seconds, you have to either keep track of it or get lucky. Even if it worked consistently, the damage you're dealing to your enemy and the health you are restoring to yourself are both incredibly small values, and it is so much easier to either deal damage to your enemies or restore health to yourself with enchantments. Vampiric Effect when strikes on the other paw is a significantly better choice. It costs 1,000 enchantment points and can only be put on weapons. This power makes the weapon restore hit points to you when it strikes an enemy, seemingly equivalent to the amount of damage the weapon deals. I find it a great shame that the at-range variant of this power is basically useless, perhaps even the worst power you can add to a custom item, especially because I think that it is really cool. Imagine carrying around a sapphire enchanted with dark magics that cause people near you to just start decaying, invigorating you. Truly immaculate flavor. While the at-range variant might be a miss mechanically but a win for role-playing, the when strikes variant is a massive win on both fronts. While I don't believe it actually adds any damage to the weapon like at range technically does, the fact is that you're guaranteed to do damage when you're attacking with a weapon, at least if you're reasonably skilled with your weapon of choice, whereas you aren't guaranteed to deal any damage with the at range variant if you're not fighting that enemy for 20 seconds. And when you deal that damage, the amount of health restored is much higher than the meager 1 hit point that you get back with at range. And of course, the flavor is so good. Weapons that have a health transferring effect to them are wonderful for storytelling, especially when you combine that with the fact that you can rename items while in the enchanting menu. Vampire's Daikatana, Bloodthirsty Axe, or the legendary Daedric Longbow, Heart Piercer is just so good. And that's the last of the powers that you can add to custom items. I hope you didn't think we were done with the enchanting section, because those were only half of the story. Now we can move on to the side effects. As a reminder, the side effects are detrimental effects you can attach to the item in exchange for having more enchantment points to work with. Several of these side effects are the opposite of one of the powers, and thus cannot be applied to an item with the opposing power. So without any more preamble, let's start with the first side effect, bad reactions from. Bad reactions from animals, Daedra, or humanoids is an effect that causes you to have a lower to hit and armor class against the specified enemy type. I don't know why undead isn't represented here like it is with the other powers and side effects that allow you to choose an enemy type, but it isn't. This side effect gives you 80 enchantment points if you choose animals, or 120 if you choose Daedra or humanoids. So, I don't really get this one, in the same way that I understand most of the other powers and side effects, but it's magic, you know? I don't see any reason why a magical item couldn't make you more susceptible to bear attacks. I kind of get it for animals, as maybe it makes you smell weird, or maybe it's going with the idea that animals get spooked around the supernatural, in either case, making them fight harder. And Daedra are inherently magical, so it's probably reasonable for any magical item to affect them in some way. But humanoids, I just don't really get that one very much. This effect does the pricing right, which is a marked improvement over the other effects for which you specify an enemy type. Animals are the least dangerous, so being worse at fighting them is the least punishing effect here, so it gives you the smallest amount of enchantment points. This is perfect, exactly as it should be. Now, we have the first side effect that is the exact opposite of one of the powers, bad rep with. Exactly like good rep with, you can choose one of the 5 social classes for 1000 enchantment points, or all 5 of them for 5000. Of course, this decreases your reputation with the relevant people. Unlike any other effect, the wiki says that this works while the item is in your inventory or in your wagon, rather than only while equipped. I don't really know how to test this exactly, so I'll leave this one as an exercise for the viewer. As I said earlier, I don't really care about reputation very much. I don't think I've ever really run into problems with it. Frankly, this is an incredibly busted side effect, granting you 5000 extra enchantment points on any item at basically no cost. I'm sure that stacking several of these items would probably run you into trouble with people eventually, but having one should be fine. And with those 5000 enchantment points, you can make that one item very much worth it. I think that the storytelling aspect here is fine, but not much more than fine. Having an item which commands jealousy in the nobility, or makes merchants less willing to have business dealings with you, is pretty cool. That's it. I'm sure there could be plenty of really interesting stories written about magical artifacts that include this as a side effect, but they likely wouldn't be interesting solely due to this side effect. Later on in Girl with Books playthrough, she makes a staff that has this effect on it, but I don't mention it in the story because it wasn't that important. It had the powers of enhancing all 6 magic skills and had bad rep with scholars. I like the idea that such a powerful staff would absolutely inspire jealousy in other mages. Extra weight is next. It is the opposite of featherweight. While featherweight sets the item's weight to a quarter of a kilogram regardless of the item's original weight, extra weight quadruples the item's original weight. It grants you 100 enchantment points. Much like the previous side effect, I think that extra weight is fine from a flavor standpoint. Unlike the previous side effect, I don't think that extra weight is bonkers overpowered. 100 enchantment points is not all that much compared to the cost of powers, in fact, there isn't a single power you can purchase that costs 100 enchantment points, except for Featherweight, which of course you couldn't take. So extra weight is really only something you would want to put on a lightweight item, ideally, that just needs a tiny amount more enchantment point budget for the powers you want on it. Now we have a bit of a complicated one, Health Leech. Health Leech comes in three varieties. Those are whenever used for 4,000 enchantment points, unless used daily for 500, and unless used weekly for 200. Let's start with whenever used. Health Leech, whenever used, will deal 16 damage to you whenever you use the enchanted item to cast a spell, or 8 points of damage to you whenever you strike an enemy with it if it is a weapon. This means that if it isn't a weapon, and it doesn't have a casts when used power, it will never deal any damage to you, thus making it a side effect that gives you 4,000 enchantment points for no cost. This is obviously pretty powerful, and should certainly be considered an exploit. At least bad rep is technically a cost you have to pay, even if it is very minor. I think that the storytelling implications of this side effect are pretty solid. Maybe the item is using a portion of your soul to cast the spell, or maybe it's blood magic, but either way, this is the perfect sort of cost to associate with a magical item. Many interesting magical items in fiction have some sort of cost associated with their use. Famously, the One Ring in Tolkien's Middle Earth makes the person wearing it invisible. However, when you are wearing it, you become easily visible by the Dark Lord and his servants. Unfortunately for Daggerfall, Health Leech is sort of the only side effect that provides an actual cost when the item is used. The bad rep is just in the background, not specifically when using the item. Extra weight applies whether you're using the item or not, and so on. Health Leech on use is the only one that has an immediate noticeable impact on you when you use the item. And I think that it is a fantastic cost, like I said, but it's the only one, and that's a bit disappointing. I love having these sorts of cursed magic items, the fantasy of having this dark artifact of ineffable power right at your fingertips. All that you need to awaken it is just a small bit of blood. Isn't that a sacrifice you'd be willing to make? Health Leech, unless used daily or weekly, is pretty much what it sounds like. If you don't use the item to cast a spell or hit an enemy after the specified time has elapsed, you start losing health. The rate appears to be 1 hit point every 20 seconds, 15 hit points per in-game hour, the same rate as regen's health and vampiric effect at range. I feel like a broken record at this point, but this is so good. The aforementioned One Ring has this exact side effect. Once someone uses the One Ring, they will, essentially, become physiologically and psychologically addicted to it as the ring corrupts their very being. Next, item deteriorates. This comes in three varieties. Item deteriorates all the time for 3,000 enchantment points, in sunlight for 1,500, and in holy places for 500. This causes the item to lose condition over time while it is equipped and the appropriate criterion is met. Girl with Book uses this side effect on most of the custom items she makes throughout the playthrough, as item deteriorates in holy places is not a downside for her. I flavored it as her using some darker magics to fortify the enchantment. Such a thing might be distasteful to some, but as she was barred from holy places anyway, it didn't affect her. I wasn't sure exactly how quickly an item with this enchantment would deteriorate, so I conducted a short test. I purchased a silver battle axe and enchanted it with item deteriorates all the time and loitered in a safe place for a while. At 12 hours in, the silver axe went from new to almost new, and at 118 hours, it was marked as broken in my inventory, though it still existed. At 120 hours, it was gone, broken entirely. I had a mithril claymore lying around, so I did the same with it. I wanted to see if the condition damage scaled with the item's maximum condition, or if it was just a flat value. The mithril claymore was still marked as new 24 hours in, and I didn't see it change to almost new until 36 hours, but that may be because I was loitering in 12-hour increments. I didn't test to see how long it would take to break, as all I cared about for the test was to see if it deteriorated at the same rate, which it did not. I don't honestly know what condition values are like in this game, and I'm not going to be looking through the code to figure them out. Suffice it to say, higher quality weapons and armor have more condition to work with, and thus would last longer with this sort of side effect put on them. Remember that this side effect only applies while the item is equipped, and I think that is a terrible shame in some ways. I get it for sunlight, while the item is unequipped you can probably shield it from the sunlight in your bag. I get it as well if the item only deteriorates when it is being used with the all the time option, but I just don't see how it being wrapped up in your backpack would help if it's in a holy place. Deteriorating in holy places seems like it should be an inherent property of the item, deteriorating while it is being used or not. I like all of these effects. I think that item deteriorates all the time should arguably be how items with constant effect powers that don't have cast when used just work by default. Item deteriorates in sunlight or in holy places are both very flavorful. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that custom items with the sunlight variant do not switch you to traveling at night like being a vampire does, which means that if you travel for a long time, your item will probably break when you arrive at your destination, though you should probably have those sorts of items unequipped all the time you aren't in a dungeon anyway. Low damage versus is the opposite of potent versus, causing the weapon enchanted with the side effect to deal less damage against a specified enemy type. Once again, we have low damage versus Undead for 800 enchantment points, Daedra for 900, Humanoids for 1000, or Animals for 1200. Once again, this side effect is an absolute flavor win, but suffers from poor pricing. Again, animals are the least dangerous category of enemies, and as such should grant the fewest enchantment points, not the most. I think that statistical malices are fine. They're a good option to have for enchanting side effects. I think that they should exist as an option, but they definitely inspire less wonder than some of the flashier options. I already gushed a little bit about potent verses, so I'll spare the time here. Suffice it to say, this is pretty flavorful and I like it. Next, we have sort of an upgrade from item deteriorates, user takes damage. Either user takes damage in sunlight for 6,000 points or in holy places for 1,000. This deals 1 damage to you every 20 seconds. Very importantly, if you choose damage in sunlight, you do not travel like a vampire, which means that when you arrive at your destination, you'll probably die. This is so many enchantment points to associate with a side effect that only takes effect while the item is equipped. Given that you'll be unequipping this item when you're not in a dungeon, this is 6,000 enchantment point budget to put whatever powers you want on this item. This is ridiculously overtuned. This is, for me, one of those times in which the mechanical impact almost completely ruins the flavor. The idea of a magical item causing you to develop a vulnerability to the sun or to holy places is really interesting to me, but because the side effect is so easy to circumvent, it just kills the intrigue. Weakens armor, 700 enchantment points, the opposite of strengthens armor. Weakens armor decreases your armor class in all body locations by 5. So, a bit of a weird story here. I wasn't exactly sure how this effect worked, so I went to test it. I was playing Daggerfall Unity release version 1.1.1. I created 2 items that had strengthens armor and equipped them both. As I expected, I got plus 5 armor class in all body locations, as strengthens armor is not supposed to stack. I then equipped an item with weakens armor. As I expected, my armor class did not change. Then I equipped a second one. Totally unexpected to me, my armor class still did not change. Then I equipped a third one, and my armor class still didn't change. While these items shouldn't stack, they should cancel each other out at the very least. So I took all of them off and then just equipped one with the weakens armor effect, and my armor class didn't decrease. Now, I have no idea if this is an error in the armor class being displayed on my character sheet, or if it is an error in my armor class actually being calculated. My intention with the test was to see what my armor class would be if I had 2 items with strengthens armor and 1 with weakens armor. It could be the case that I would have plus 5 armor class, because the first strengthens armor and weakens armor effect cancel each other out, and I'm left with the second strengthens armor effect. It could also be the case that I have multiple sources of strengthens armor, which do not stack, so that's plus 5, and then I have a source of weakens armor, so that's minus 5, resulting in a net 0. Both of these would make perfect sense. So, as Daggerfall Unity was bugged at the time, I decided to check Classic to figure out how it should work, and what I found was kind of weird. So I put on an item with Weakens Armor, just to make sure it actually worked, and it did, as expected. Then I put on an item with Strengthens Armor, and there was no change. So I unequipped them and re-equipped them, putting the Strengthens Armor on first, and then the Weakens Armor, to see if the equip order mattered. And I had the armor classed as though it was only affected by the Weakens Armor effect, minus 5 to all locations. So then I put on a second item with Strengthens Armor, and it jumped up all the way to plus 5 in all locations. So the way that it seems to be supposed to work is not that they counteract each other, but the Weakens Armor effect overrides the Strengthens Armor effect, unless you have more instances of Strengthens Armor. I actually think that this, making the negative outweigh the positive, is a good way to handle these sorts of opposing effects. These are supposed to be disadvantages after all, and it shouldn't be too easy to circumvent them, as I've said before. This was a bit of an excursion for me. I tend not to do much testing in Classic if I can avoid it, as it is easier to test things quickly in Unity. I'm fortunate I had a save that was convenient for it. Anyway, that's a lot of words for a side effect that isn't actually all that interesting. Once again, this is just a statistical malice. It's nice. Those of you who have played future Elder Scrolls titles may have noticed something peculiar when I was describing the way that enchantments work, and that is that I've never once mentioned soul gems. In future Elder Scrolls titles, specially crafted gems filled with the soul of some poor creature are required to charge items with enchantments. This is not the case in Daggerfall, but soul traps do exist, and that is where our final side effect comes into play, Soulbound. Soulbound is considered a side effect and is totally optional. Custom items do not require a soul to be created like they do in future installments of the series. Each non-human creature in the game has a soul value associated with it, granting differing amounts of enchantment points. A filled soul trap can be purchased from specific vendors or acquired by successfully casting a soul trap spell on a target and then killing it while you have an empty soul trap in your inventory. I am not going to go through each and every soul value of all creatures in this game, as some things are beyond the pale even for this video. Suffice it to say, generally, the more powerful the enemy, the higher value the soul. Also, weird side note, the phrase beyond the pale is kind of fucked up. It's probably either a reference to historical anti-Semitism in Russia or the colonial ventures of the English in Ireland. It's also just really weird that it could be a reference to either of those things, but it is also possible that it isn't actually a reference to either of those things, as there's at least one other place that has been referred to as a pale in English, Calais. In addition to different amounts of enchantment points from different creatures' souls, some souls have inherent powers and side effects associated with them. For example, the soul of a Daedra Lord comes with potent versus Daedra, user takes damage in holy places, and extra weight. The inherent powers and side effects do not have any impact on your enchantment point budget, though they do take up your limited 10 slots for powers and side effects. So, for example, the Daedra Lord's Soulbound disadvantage would take up a total of 4 of your 10 slots, 3 for the aforementioned effects, as well as 1 for Soulbound itself. Additionally, any powers the Soulbound side effect grants, while it does not count towards your enchantment point budget, do count towards the cost in gold you need to pay to purchase the enchantment. Finally, when an item with the soulbound side effect is destroyed, the soul that was trapped inside is unleashed upon you, seeking revenge. If, for example, you have an item with a Daedra Lord soulbound to it, when that item breaks, a Daedra Lord will spawn near you and attack you. I think that this is a fantastic cost to associate with this effect. I like that there is some sort of power source associated with enchanting in the Elder Scrolls, that being the power of the souls of living creatures. Interestingly, Daggerfall is the only one that has a cost associated with this power source, at least a cost aside from the moral implications, that being the soul that comes out to attack you if the item breaks. There's more lore about soul trapping and the ideal masters of the soul cairn in the very next game of the franchise, the spin-off title, An Elder Scrolls Legend Battlespire, released in 1997. But this isn't a video about the Elder Scrolls lore, and that stuff came later, having no bearing on Daggerfall as it is. I like that enchantments can be made without this power source, but can become much more powerful with it. I think that this is a good way to do enchanting. Alright, so that was a lot of yapping about the various enchantments in Daggerfall. To what end? Well, as I said in the intro, this video is a deep dive into the mechanics of the game, but it is also supposed to be an essay on game design. So what are the key takeaways from the game design of magical items in Daggerfall? First and foremost, I think that the inclusion of side effects on custom items is a wonderful idea. It offers so much mechanical intrigue, as well as storytelling potential and flavor. I've been using the word flavor a lot, and I guess I should probably explain what I mean by it. Flavor is a catch-all term to describe that which is difficult to describe. Storytelling, world building, role playing, these are all part of it. It's a way of describing things that simply feel good, even if maybe you can't describe exactly why they feel good or maybe even how they feel good. Magic the Gathering is a collectible card game you may have heard of before. Magic cards often have little bits of italicized text at the bottom of the text box. These bits of italicized text don't have any mechanical function within the game, but they do tell little stories, offer insights into the world, or sometimes just make jokes. but they're all called flavor text. Within the game of Magic, this flavor text has absolutely no function, but Magic would be far worse as a game without it. Warhammer 40,000 is a tabletop wargame that you may have also heard of before. In Warhammer 40k army codices, the books are filled with lore and stories about the relevant army before you get to any of the rules. Warhammer players collectively refer to this lore as fluff. You don't need fluff, but it's warm and cozy, and even in the grim darkness of the 41st or 43rd or 49th millennium, or wherever the hell we're at now, you still want that bit of coziness. These are both examples of flavor. As I said with Magic the Gathering, and the same rings true in Warhammer 40k, the games, mechanically, would be no less interesting without their respective forms of flavor. But games aren't all about mechanics. Games are about stories, about worlds, about characters, about laughing and crying, about flavor. Good mechanics are the basis of a good game, but great games need to be more than just a foundation. To echo words I said quite a while ago at this point, I promise I will get back to this point later. What else can we learn about magic from Enchanting in Daggerfall? Another big takeaway for me is that there should be more to magic than just statistical bonuses and malices. These are fine, in fact, I think they're necessary, but they aren't all that magic should be. The powers and side effects that I talked the most about were the ones that weren't statistical effects, except maybe weakens armor, but that's for other reasons. But I talked about those more because they're more interesting and more worth talking about. I want to reiterate that statistical changes are necessary. Maybe you want your sword to deal 3 fire damage to whatever you hit with it. That's great, it's all well and good. You should have that option. A robust enchanting system would allow you that option. But maybe you also want your sword to shed light. It's on fire, after all. I think that a robust enchanting system would allow you that option as well. Importantly, I don't think they should be tied to the same effect. Sometimes you'd just want a sword that glows, it doesn't need to deal fire damage, and sometimes you just want a sword that does fire damage, it doesn't need to glow. Being able to combine all sorts of different effects, negative and positive, is not only interesting mechanically, but also interesting from a flavor standpoint. I think that if a game designer were interested in making a robust enchanting system, they should take inspiration from this system and consider implementing a sort of advantage/disadvantage system like this. And they needn't limit themselves to just the powers and side effects that Daggerfall has. There are so many more hypothetical options. The only limit is your creativity and your willingness to code. But I think that one of the most important takeaways here is a discussion about game balance. As I said all the way at the beginning of the enchanting section, making custom magic items is the most powerful thing you can do in this game. However, I didn't make very many points about game balance throughout the section. The main reason for that is because I don't mind magical items being very powerful. In fact, to some degree, I think they should be. The main problem for me with the game balance of Enchanting and Daggerfall is that some of the side effects, especially some of the ones with the highest enchantment point values, are incredibly easy to circumvent. I think it is totally okay to have absolutely busted magic items. In fact, I think it's good to have some of them in a game. But if you're going to have a system where magic items have side effects, they have to have side effects. In order for a player to feel like they deserve to have an incredibly powerful item, they have to be forced to deal with the consequences of that item. We've gotten back to the topic of game balance, and I want to reiterate what I said my preferred approach to balancing single player games was vibes. I think that with more playtesting time, the developers of Daggerfall could have felt out the vibes of enchanting more and come to a better idea of how many enchantment points effects should have either cost or granted. And I think that if they had playtested more, they would have felt that some of the side effects were too easy to circumvent, and I think that they would have caught the bad vibes from that. And I think that they would have then gone on to tweak those numbers in accordance with those bad vibes. I know that vibes are incredibly imprecise, but I think it's okay for magic to be a bit fuzzy around the edges. I don't expect, and perhaps don't even want, perfect balance, but I do want the game to feel right when I play it. Tweaking numbers around could have made the game feel a bit better. But with all of that said, I think it's time to be done with enchanting and get back to the story of Girl with Book. Girl with Book continued her courier work and practiced her skills and soon got another letter, this time from Prince Lotan of Sentinel. She hadn't yet heeded Morgaya of Wayrest's letter. It was time, she figured, to finally do so. While she still wasn't confident in her ability to survive the hostile environments of these dungeons, she had more confidence in being able to please royalty. She was wrong, however, as Morgaya asked her to deliver a letter to the King of Worms in a vile place known as Scourge Barrow. The necromancer's vile lair was infested by the undead and wild animals. The undead were quite formidable, though the animals were easier to fend off. Luckily for Girl with Book, she found the King of Worms' audience chamber rather quickly. She recalled to safety after delivering the letter from Morgaya and getting the return message. Morgaya gave her a token prize for her service, but also a bit of advice. Girl with Book didn't have an in with anyone important at Castle Daggerfall, so better to start with someone a bit lower down on the social ladder. While she had successfully completed the task at hand, Girl with Book didn't feel as though the short time spent had sufficiently tested her skill, so she set out to undergo a more proper test. And so, once again, Girl with Book went into the depths of a dungeon in search of a rare ingredient. She found her skills sufficient, but she couldn't settle for merely sufficient. The dungeons that Girl with Book had explored had provided her with opportunities to collect valuable items, but her frailty had prevented her from carrying many of them at a time. If she wanted to continue to expand her spellbook, she could do with the extra funds. So, once again, Girl with Book turned to enchantment. She took another amulet and enchanted it to lighten the weight of her bags, fastening it to one of the straps that held them. And so she went into another dungeon and found it easier. She was learning, she was improving, her forms were getting better, her pronunciation more precise. She expanded her spellbook and went into another dungeon. The spells she just learned would have been incredibly difficult to cast just a few months ago, but now they were simple and powerful. Struggle has truly been a good teacher to her. Not long after, the Mages Guild had recognized her as an archmage. She was honored, to be sure, but surprised. Was she truly becoming so skilled? She still suffered from frailty, though recently she'd begun bolstering her fortitude with her magic. Making long-lasting changes to her body was a slow process, however, and she'd yet to see any results from that. Being named as one of the few archmages in Tamriel told Girl with Book that she was ready for whatever would come next. She had put off her duty in the Iliac Bay long enough, and set her mind to answering the summons of Prince Lotan. Before she left for Sentinel, though, she took together most of her gold and purchased many reagents. She poured all of them into a bracelet of warding to protect her from harm. Girl with Book is an archmage now, which implies a certain skill level in the 6 schools of magic. I wanted to talk a bit more about the magic skills and player level. If you cast your mind back to the section on spell mechanics, you may remember 2 key details on how spells work. Firstly, the cost of all spell effects is based on your skill level in the relevant school of magic. Secondly, the chance, duration, and magnitude are all based in part on your character level. I want to talk a little bit more about these 2 things and some of the implications they have. Let's start with the cost of spell effects. There are throughout gaming various approaches to dealing with low-level spells as your level improves. In a game like Morrowind, where you have a chance to successfully cast a spell, as your skill improves, that chance goes up. In some games, increasing a skill simply makes numbers on the spell go up. In games like Daggerfall, however, increasing the skill makes the cost to cast them go down. I think that this is a brilliant way of doing things. Firstly, it gives you a sense of progression. You get to see with your eyes not only the somewhat arbitrary skill value go up, but the direct ramifications of it. I've played plenty of games where I got an increase to a skill and I was happy about it, but then I asked, well, what does +1 swords skill actually do for me? In Daggerfall, not only do you get a little alert that your character's alteration skill has increased, but when you go into your character's spellbook, you'll notice that the spell they've been casting for 60 spell points now only costs 58. Sure, maybe saving 1 or 2 spell points here and there isn't all that impactful. It is, however, a direct and noticeable effect of a character's skill improving, and at least in the back of your mind, you know that it'll add up to be significant eventually. Stats and skills are one thing, and watching them go up is certainly enjoyable, but a derived statistic like hit points, damage modifier, evasion chance, or in this case, spell point cost of spells, are easier to understand and have a greater direct impact on gameplay than more abstract things like strength or agility. A player might not necessarily know what it means for their strength to go up by 4 or their skill with blowguns to increase by 3, but a player definitely does know what it means for their damage rating to go up by 1 or their dodge chance to increase by 2%. In the same way, a player might not know exactly what it means for their thaumaturgy skill to go up by 1%, but they do know what it means for a given thaumaturgy spell to be 3 spell points cheaper to cast. I think there's a lot of value in tapping into that intuitive understanding. Secondly, it offers a good way of gating high power spells behind certain skill levels. When I've played video games, I've looked at the list of spells I could learn, and I see one that I think is really cool, but I can't cast it. Why? I have enough spell points to cast this spell. Well, you need to have a skill level of 25 to cast this spell. Why? Because you need to have a skill level of 25 to cast this spell. This isn't a fundamentally bad way of dealing with spell power levels, but it does feel arbitrary. Games rarely go into the in-universe mechanical details of how magic actually works and how you actually cast spells. It could be that the spells that require a skill level of 25 require some sort of specific technique to cast that you don't learn until that skill level, and that's why it requires skill level 25. But the game doesn't tell you that, it just locks the spell behind a skill level. Like I said, this could make total sense, but without further context, that sort of system just feels arbitrary to the player. Either that or it feels like a system that was only put in for the sake of game balance. Yet again, I'm going to touch on balance for a moment. I feel like game balance should ideally come naturally. Implementing arbitrary systems for the sake of balance can feel like game balance is a leash, holding you back from what you should be able to do if those systems were not in place. You want a game to be balanced so it feels good for everyone involved. Ideally, balance would make people feel like they're capable of doing things because the game is balanced. I don't think you want a game to feel like the game balance is limiting you rather than empowering you. In Daggerfall, you can purchase any spell at any time and put it in your spell book, even if you can't cast it. That's a really nice feature to have, and I've done that a number of times. In some games, learning spells that you can't cast simply isn't an option. Additionally, rather than gate a given spell behind a certain skill threshold, your only limitations in Daggerfall are your pool of spell points and your willingness to spend your spell points on certain spells. If you have 300 maximum spell points, you can cast a spell that costs 300 spell points to cast if you really want to. A spell that expensive is probably a reasonably powerful spell of a school that you aren't all that skilled in, but if you have the spell points, you can cast it. You may well not want to cast that spell, you'd probably be better off saving your spell points to cast other spells, but the game gives you that option, and that's really cool, and something that a lot of other games don't do. Another way in which this sort of system really works is in the case of spells with spell effects from multiple schools. Because the spell itself gets its cost from a summation of the spell effects within, if we take our old friend Forcebolt, for instance, you can reduce the cost of the spell by mastering the Destruction School or Alteration School. Or you can reduce the cost of the spell by increasing both schools. While Forcebolt isn't exactly a great example of this principle due to the destruction portion of that spell being far less powerful than the alteration portion, it would very much apply to custom spells. I think that the idea there is pretty cool. You can sort of use one skill in one school of magic to supplement a lack of skill in another school. I should clarify that it doesn't technically work this way, as the cost of spell effects are simply added together to get the spell cost. But it kind of feels that way. You can, as you progress your skill in one school of magic, get copies of a spell you like and add some other effects of other schools to it, bringing the spell up to its old spell point cost, but adding some new effects to it. There is one last thing I need to address about spell effect cost. Given that the maximum skill level you can have normally is 100%, spell effect costs get a little weird if you go above that. I don't remember exactly where the breakpoint is, but at least at 110% skill level, the cost of all relevant spell effects will be zero, no matter how powerful it is. This means that all of your spells will cost the minimum of 5 spell points if you have the relevant schools at 110% or higher. This is achievable with relative ease using magical items due to the enhances skill power. I do not know if this is intended by the game developers or if it is an unintended consequence of the cost calculations. I'm also not sure if it matters. I think this is incredibly interesting either way, and I also think I really like it. Sure, there are obviously some balance problems when it comes to arbitrarily powerful spells all being costed at the minimum price. Given that magical items are needed to achieve this effect, I think the idea that once you both achieve mastery and enchant items to assist you, you can cast even the most powerful of spells for the bare minimum cost is really neat. It makes me think of a perpetual motion machine. You have achieved true zero friction spellcasting. There are no spell points lost as heat in this system. I think that it is important that this is not something that can be achieved without magical items. While spells are much cheaper at 100% in a skill, they aren't set to the bare minimum. You would need a magical material to make a perpetual motion machine, after all. When I decided to do this playthrough, I had a specific goal. I wanted to become the most powerful mage in Tamriel. In order to do that, I wanted to achieve the maximum level for this character. Daggerfall does have a maximum level, but it actually differs from character to character due to randomness in character creation. So I didn't know exactly what level I would need to achieve, but I knew it would be in the 28 to 30 range. It did end up being level 28 for Girl with Book, and I knew that I wanted to achieve that maximum level by increasing all 6 of my skills in the schools of magic to their maximum values. This brings us back to the spell effects scaling with character level. This is very much based on tabletop role playing games, as older computer role playing games often were, but I see it far less often in modern video gaming. This is a pretty simple way to implement increasing the power of spells as your character improves. Characters that rely on equipment get better as they level up by getting better equipment, but there might not always be equipment that impacts spell casting. Characters that rely on magic need to have some way to get better as their level increases. You don't necessarily need to get a cool piece of equipment as a mage if your spells just increase in power over time. Knowing that because you're a level higher, your spells are all better now provides the same sort of joy that finding a new weapon does. I don't necessarily think that this is the best way for your spells to get better as your character improves, especially in combination with the fact that your spells get cheaper as your skill improves. In Daggerfall, at least, your spells already get cheaper as your skill level improves, which means that then you can get a new spell that costs the same as the first spell used to, but has higher values associated with it. That, in and of itself, can be the way in which your spells grow more powerful. I think that a system in which spells increase based on your player level is far more suited for games in which you don't have variable spell cost. In Dungeons and Dragons, for example, you only have so many spells you can cast per day. You don't have a blue bar like you do in most computer role playing games. A spell always costs a spell slot, so if you want the spells to get better as your character does, you need to improve the spell in some way. And you probably do want the spells to get better as your character gets better, because there are few things more disheartening for game players than looking at all the tools they have at their disposal and not being able to make use of them. On the other paw, though, I don't hate this choice for Daggerfall. I think that it is ultimately okay to have the power of spells scale up as well as the cost scale down. I think that if a hypothetical computer RPG were to come out today with this sort of mechanic, it could totally work, but the developers would need to be pretty careful about the balance. I have plenty of times played Daggerfall, and magic felt fine to me, neither underpowered nor overpowered. At least to me personally, magic doesn't really start feeling overpowered until you get 110% skill levels and cast ridiculous spells for basically free. High powered, yes, but not really overpowered. So we've talked a little bit about the effects caused by increasing your skill in the magical schools, but let's talk a bit more about how you actually increase your skills. As I mentioned briefly, casting a spell contributes towards increasing your skill level in all of the schools of effects within that spell. Chiefly, it does not matter how powerful the spell you cast was. If you cast a destruction spell that cost 5 spell points, it will contribute the same towards your advancement as casting a destruction spell that costs 500 spell points. This allows for the creation of training spells that have the lowest possible cost of 5 spell points and constantly casting them over and over again to increase your skill level. And because a spell counts towards advancing all applicable magic skills, you can advance upwards of 3 schools with one training spell. The same thing occurs in Daggerfall's sequel, Morrowind. This is fundamentally unsatisfying. It just doesn't feel right that a tiny, ineffectual spell can increase your understanding of an art so complex as magic as much as an elaborate masterpiece of spellcraft. I really don't like this design decision. But The Elder Scrolls is mechanically built on the concept of skills advancing with use rather than by skill points or some such, and I'm going to propose two similar systems that I think solve this problem. Firstly, let us suppose that you have a game where spells have skill level values associated with them. I think it is important that you don't have all the spells be unlocked in large batches like in Oblivion, where a bunch of spells require levels 25, 50, 75, and 100. I think that having batches like that devalues the feeling of increasing your skills one level at a time and disproportionately increases the good feeling of increasing your skill to a specific bracket. I would propose a system similar to World of Warcraft's Professions. I should note that I've not played WoW in a while and I don't care to get into the specifics, and all of those specifics have probably changed. Suffice it to say, I'm talking about vanilla through Wrath here. In this system, spells of varying levels would fall into four brackets. Spells a few levels above your skill level would go into the first bracket. Spells around your skill level would go into the second. Spells a little bit below your skill level would go into the third bracket. All the spells significantly below your skill level would go into the fourth bracket. All of these brackets should be a range, perhaps around 5 levels worth. If you were skill level 45, say, your third bracket might start at 38 or so, and your first bracket might end at around 52 or so. If you cast spells in the first bracket, the successful spell cast would be guaranteed to contribute to you leveling your skill. If you cast a spell in the second bracket, it would have a good chance to contribute towards leveling your skill, say 2 and 3 times. If you cast a spell in the third bracket, it would be less likely to contribute, say 1 and 3 times. And if you cast a spell in the fourth bracket, it will never, or perhaps very rarely, contribute towards your skill increasing. This system would accommodate spells with skill levels associated with them, and I think it would be a lot more satisfying to increase your magic skills with a system like this rather than being incentivized to recast the same training spell for hours on end. If the spell point cost of spells increased on average as the spell level increased, you'd actually get an at least somewhat interesting choice between casting more spells that are less likely to advance your skill and fewer spells that are more likely to advance your skill. Secondly, let's go with Daggerfall as it is, where spells decrease in cost as your skill gets higher. Rather than just advancing your skill upon casting a spell, let's have it contribute towards advancement based on the spell's cost. Say you cast a spell that costs 37 spell points. Well, that's 37 points towards contributing to your skill advancing. You could even do a calculation here. Maybe instead of 37 points towards advancement, it's 3.7. Then you'd have a chance to round up or down. I think that this is a much better system over Daggerfall, as it disincentivizes, or depending on rounding, outright bars use of training spells. As you increase in skill level, the cost of your spells goes down, which means that the spells you were casting last level will advance you just a bit slower this level. Given that it is super intuitive, if the player was just given the small prod of a dialogue or loading screen tip or whatever saying, casting more powerful spells increases your skill faster, or maybe not even that much, the concept would immediately click for that player. You wouldn't need to explain to them how the system worked at all unless they just really wanted to know the exact maths behind it. As I said, the main conceit when it comes to leveling in the Elder Scrolls is that skill usage is what determines skill advancement. I think that this is very solid from both a mechanics and flavor standpoint. Frankly, I think that Daggerfall really only has that one small problem of training spells when it comes to leveling. I don't know if either of my proposed changes would really solve that problem well, or if they would more likely implement other unforeseen problems, but I think that it's always good to provide ideas, even if only to start a conversation. Girl with Book isn't max level yet, but she will be eventually, so let's get back to her. And so, Girl with Book set sail for Sentinel. She arrived on the 3rd of Sun's Dusk, right in the middle of Hammerfell's wet season. It was very wet as she rode into Sentinel in the midst of a gentle storm, and much too warm for her Nord blood. She also realized that she had forgotten her birthday this year, and double-checked her pack to make sure her copy of King Edward Part 12 wasn't getting wet. She met with Lotan of Sentinel, and, in exchange for information she needed, agreed to inquire about the fate of Lotan's missing brother, Arthago. Unfortunately, no one who Girl with Book spoke with were willing or able to tell her anything about the missing prince. Fortunately, she got a letter from a mysterious source promising information. She met with the person who sent the letter, who revealed that he was an agent of the Underking. He told her to investigate Castle Fallen if she wanted to know the truth. Having no other leads, she did so. Not long after entering the castle, Girl with Book managed to convince one of the orcs who had overrun the place not to attack. She explained why she was there, and the orc pointed her to a closet nearby. She looked inside and did indeed find a document written by Prince Arthago. Arthago was, like her, bright and clever and with a love of books. Also, like her, he was sickly and frail as a child. Reading through his last words, directly brought about by his own parents, brought her to tears. Few things in her life would need to have been different for her to have suffered the same grim fate as he. She took many long moments to stifle her tears and to calm her mind. She recalled to Prince Lotan and gave him the document. Even after calming herself, she still barely heard the words the prince said, let alone pay them mind. She departed from the castle, and as she stepped back outside, once again shed tears. Not long after, she got a letter from Queen Akarithi of Sentinel. Girl with Book was tempted to tear the thing to pieces at once, but her sense of duty came over her and stopped her. She went and met with the queen. She asked Girl with Book to infiltrate Castle Wayrest and recover a special painting for her. Girl with Book accepted, but she refused to do any killing in the service of this vile woman. She went to Castle Wayrest and, with her illusion magic, slipped by all of the guards in her way to the painting. She grabbed the painting and recalled to Sentinel. She gave the painting to Akarithi and received payment. Only gold, no information that would help her in any way. Girl with Book left the castle, fuming. She had gotten a summons from the King of Worms, that necromancer in Scourge Barrow that she'd spoken with for Morgaya of Wayrest, and knew that he would likely understand her need for information. So she traveled back to Scourge Barrow and met with him once again. He asked her to go into the depths of Castle Sentinel and steal the soul of Prince Carolus, now a powerful lich. While Girl with Book was wary of defeating a lich, she saw this as an opportunity. Girl with Book couldn't directly harm Akarithi given her station, but she could certainly cause a problem for her. She agreed to the King of Worms' deal and traveled to Sentinel once again. As she got into Sentinel, she got a letter. Once again, an agent of the Underking had sent her a message with promise of information. They said that they would wait for 1 month for Girl with Book to come. She knew that the King of Worms, as a lich, would surely be patient, and, while she would like to get some small measure of revenge on Queen Akarithi for her foul deeds, she must be patient and put her duty to the Emperor above her personal goals, and so she went to meet with the Underking's agent. He told Girl with Book that the necromancers had stolen a tunic from the Underking, cursed it, and given it to the Blades. The Underking, apparently for his own reasons, wished no harm upon the Blades, and Girl with Book was tasked with retrieving this item. While she was sure this would hurt her relationship with the King of Worms, she owed him no loyalty. So long as she did the job he gave her, she saw no reason he wouldn't repay her with the information promised, even if she worked against him in other ways, and so she went into Castle Hlugwitch, a stronghold of the Blades, to retrieve the magical tunic. Girl with Book truly had come a long way with her skills. She infiltrated a castle full of blades with ease, grabbed the tunic, and recalled to safety. She didn't even feel her power taxed hardly at all. She returned the item to the agent of the Underking, who cleansed the cursed tunic, and gave it back as part of her reward. He also revealed the location of Lysandas's true resting place, and so she went back to Sentinel. Girl with Book took some small pleasure in doing this particular task, retrieving the soul of Prince Carolus, now a lich, from the depths of Castle Sentinel. Some small measure of revenge against Queen Akarithy would have to suffice. She went through the depths of the castle, and the guards that got in her way didn't stand a chance. She found the Lich Prince beyond an elaborate puzzle of magical fields through which she could not pass, but her quick mind got her through the puzzle with ease. Prince Carolus, apparently, hadn't properly prepared his will to resist her magic, and was slain instantly. She found that she was less surprised with the ease with which she dispatched a powerful enemy, and more surprised at her disappointment with the lack of challenge. Girl with Book took the enchanted scarab filled with Prince Carolus's soul back to the King of Worms. Just as she thought he would, the King of Worms, while displeased with the work she did against him, upheld his end of the bargain, granting her the precious information she sought. The Under King was, in fact, Zurin Arctus, battle mage of Tiber Septim, betrayed at the end of Tiber's conquests. If his soul should be restored to his body, the King of Worms promised, it would throw all of Tamriel into chaos. This is the moment that none of you have been waiting for. We're going to go over each and every spell effect. I'm going to go over them school by school. No more dilly-dallying. We're starting with the School of Alteration. Firstly, we have the Climbing spell effect. Climbing has neither chance nor magnitude, only duration. The climbing effect makes you climb walls at twice the normal speed. The climbing effect doesn't seem to increase your chance to successfully climb at all, it just makes you move faster while climbing. This does sort of help with success rate, though, as you move further between the skill checks. This effect is very affordable, spell point-wise. Even characters who've never cast a spell before could cast a climbing spell with ease. I think that this sort of accessibility is ideal for a utility spell effect like climbing. Climbing competes with another spell effect, Levitate. We'll talk about that effect later. While climbing offers less utility than Levitate, because it is a cheap spell effect, it offers a way to get similar utility on a less experienced character or one who is not focused on spellcasting as a playstyle. Given that the ability to climb walls is present in Daggerfall, I think it makes perfect sense to include a climbing effect. Spider Climb is an ever-present spell in fantasy tabletop RPGs, so its inclusion fits right into Daggerfall. I think that this sort of effect is paramount for wizardly characters. Given that the archetypal mage is a relatively weak character, having spells to explicitly overcome their weakness, like spells for running, climbing, swimming, etc., is a perfect direction to go in. Similarly, we have Jumping. The Jumping spell effect, like the Climbing effect, is very inexpensive to cast and has only duration with no chance or magnitude. The Jumping spell effect doubles your jump height. Because you don't lose speed in the air in Daggerfall, or at least if you do, the loss is totally negligible, this also effectively doubles the length of your jump. I should note that because of the cramped quarters in a lot of dungeons, you may not get full value from the double height. This fits right in alongside Climbing as a spell to supplement a character's lack of physical strength, aiding them in their athletic pursuits. This effect also competes directly with Levitate like Climbing does, but is also an effect worth considering because of its low cost. Furthermore, we have the effect of water breathing. This effect, unsurprisingly, allows you to breathe underwater. Like Climbing and Jumping, water breathing only has duration, and is very cheap to cast. Although it doesn't really increase your mobility in any way, it does allow you to stay underwater for longer, potentially allowing you to explore more. All three of these effects are great, and I have no complaints about any of them. Elemental Resistance is the next spell effect, broken up into 5 sub-effects based on the element chosen. The elements in question are Fire, Frost, Shock, Poison, and Magicka. The spell effect has duration and chance of success. Elemental Resistance is of an average sort of cost, neither expensive nor inexpensive. When you're subjected to the spell of the relevant element, you have a chance to totally resist the spell. However, if you do not totally resist the spell, the resistance spell effect seems to have the damage incoming. I'm not sure how it works with non-damaging offensive spells, and I've had a bit of trouble testing the spell effect. You could approach this spell effect in 2 ways, I think. You could push the chance up to be 100% so that you always resist the relevant element, or you could totally ignore chance and just have the duration last a while, and cast the spell just for damage reduction. This is a core effect, the kind of thing that basically has to exist in any sort of game with damage types. There really isn't any point in having damage types if there are no resistances or vulnerabilities to them. Now we have the first and only offensive spell effect of the Alteration School, Paralyze. Paralyze has chance of success and duration, but no magnitude. If an enemy fails their save against a spell with Paralyze, they will be totally unable to move or attack for the duration of the Paralyze effect. You are fully free to attack them while they're defenseless, or simply walk past. Paralyze is an expensive spell effect, though very powerful. Generally, I think it is better to prioritize increasing chance over duration. If you're reasonably skilled in melee combat, the opponent doesn't need to be paralyzed for very long for you to dispatch them, so even the base duration of 1 round plus 1 round per level is long enough at levels, say, 5 and up. Paralyze is an amazing effect for the flavor of magic. I like to imagine a character monologuing evilly at whomever they paralyze, knowing that there's nothing their victim can do to stop them, but maybe that's just a sadistic fantasy of mine. Generally, I consider utility and control effects to be the pinnacle of magic in games, and Paralyze is a good example of that. This is another point that I swear for real I will get back to later, pinky promise. Next is the shield effect. Shield creates a magical barrier with its own hit point total that takes damage before you. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell how many of the hit points the shield has left once it has started taking damage, though the spell effect does go away once the hit points are totally depleted. Do keep in mind that if you make a custom spell that has shield as well as some other effect, the other effect and thus the spell icon on your user interface will remain after the shield is depleted. This might lead you into thinking that you still have your shield up. Shield has duration and magnitude, magnitude defining the number of hit points the shield has. Shield is a little pricey spell point wise and competes with the heal and regenerate spell effects. The big advantage of shield over effects which restore hit points is that if you have a low hit point maximum, shield may allow you to take more damage than you would normally survive, and you can't restore any hit points if you're dead. I love this spell effect, and I always have. In every game where an option like this is available, I always try it out to see if it feels good. In Daggerfall, it feels alright. It certainly could be worse. I'm basically 100% sure this is just my preference, but I find that I'd rather use health restoration than shield in Daggerfall. I rarely play characters with low health totals, so the one upside that shield has over health restoration is negligible for me 99% of the time. I will say though that Girl with Book made good use of this effect, as she did have a low health total. Additionally, shield has a big downside over health restoration, using your spell points for potentially very little gain. If you cast shield, you may not end up taking any damage before the shield wears off. This is most prominent at low character level, as the duration may not be very long. If you don't get any use out of your spell, then you've wasted spell points, which are a pretty valuable resource. This downside actually applies to any proactive spell effect. Let me use an example to illustrate. If, for example, you have full health, you're never going to, intentionally anyway, cast a healing spell on yourself. You're never going to waste spell points with a healing spell. Technically, you can spend them suboptimally if you use a spell that heals for significantly more than you need to heal, but you're never going to waste them spending them for nothing. Another example would be the aforementioned elemental resistance. If you cast fire resistance and aren't subjected to any fire effects, you've wasted spell points. Ultimately, however, spell points can be regenerated simply by resting, and if you're willing to spend the time to do so, are in unlimited supply. If you're okay with the frankly minor penalty that proactive spells incur, you won't find your experience with magic in this game suffers very much. Finally, we have Slow Fall. It's, not very good. I like Slow Fall. It is super useful in a lot of games and makes perfect sense to exist as far as a magical spell effect goes. But it just isn't all that useful in Daggerfall. There simply are not very many long falls for which you even could utilize Slow Fall. Anyway, Slow Fall has only duration and is unfortunately a rather expensive spell effect for what you get. Slow fall makes you fall at a rate slow enough to avoid all fall damage. I should note that if you cast a spell too close to the ground, you may land and take damage before you fully cast the spell. For whatever reason, you're not allowed to jump while the effect is active. I suppose to not create conflict, competition, or unforeseen circumstances with or relating to the jumping spell effect. Creating a very short duration slowfall spell for hopping down elevator shafts is something one could probably do, and they might get some utility out of it. On the other paw, though, they could just as easily create a climbing spell to climb down elevator shafts, and they'd probably end up both saving spell points and using the same spell to get back up the shaft. Unfortunately, slow falling is just not super useful in Daggerfall. If the spell point cost of the effect were lower, I'd be able to forgive it that, but it isn't, so I can't. So that's the School of Alteration. It's a school that offers a lot of utility, but also some defensive options, as well as a singular, powerful offensive option. It is a very well-rounded school of magic, and is a good choice if you want to specialize in one school. It's a school that I very much love. It has a lot of mechanical and flavor wins. The mobility spells are great, perfect utility for a weak mage that gets winded a bit too easily. Elemental resistance and shield are solid defensive options, a way to truly set aside the weakness of your flesh and resist through force of will alone. Paralyze is a powerful offensive tool, allowing you to exert a lot of control over your enemies. And Slowfall, well, it's good in other games. Now we're on to the School of Destruction. Destruction, by its very nature, is much more focused on offensive spell effects, a stark contrast from the prior school. So let's get started. Firstly, I'm going to lump two different spell effects together. We have damage and continuous damage. Damage has magnitude, and continuous damage has magnitude and duration. As you might imagine, the only difference between these two effects is that continuous damage does damage over time, doing its magnitude in damage each round about 5 seconds. There are two interesting things to be said here. The first is that spells have elements associated with them, which allows for enemies to be resistant to, say, fire or frost. Thus, you might want various different damaging or continuously damaging spells of a variety of elements to avoid those resistances. Secondly, you can actually choose to damage more than just health. Fatigue and spell points, as well as health, are options. If you're afraid of a mage, you can try to damage their spell points so that they can't attack you with magic of their own. And it would be worth it, by the way. Your spell will probably do more damage to their spell points than it would cost for you to cast. Of course, they could resist the spell. Damage is a mid-priced effect, neither expensive nor inexpensive. Continuous damage is a bit weird, though. Originally in this script, I was planning on talking about how continuous damage was far too cheap of a spell effect in comparison to the damage effect, as even at the base duration of 1 round plus 1 round per level, it would be several instances of very similar damage values. But then I tested some things and found that that wasn't exactly true. I'm going to put a short clip of some findings on screen. For this brief demo, I didn't adjust the duration of the continuous damage effects at all, and all of these spells are delivered by touch. What I found was that the base magnitude portion of continuous damage is far more expensive than the scaling portion of magnitude. I should state for the record that this character has destruction at 26%, but the actual cost isn't what matters here, it's the comparison between costs that matters. What we can see is that for spells with identical magnitudes, the continuous damage version of the spell can be more than twice as expensive as the damage version if the spell has a large base magnitude and low scaling magnitude, or the continuous damage version can be only about 10% more expensive than the damage version if the base magnitude is low and the scaling magnitude is higher. For general use of all spell effects in this game, I tend to prioritize scaling values for chance, duration, and magnitude over base values, but as is evidenced by this demonstration, this is particularly relevant to the continuous damage spell effect. As far as the flavor of these effects, well, it's dealing damage with magic. It's fine. In some games it's very flashy, but not really all that interesting. Next, we have a different sort of damage effect, Disintegrate. Disintegrate only has chance of success. If the spell works, the target is instantly slain. This spell effect is rather costly and obviously very powerful. This is the ultimate save or suck spell. There isn't much worse you can do to someone as far as combat goes than instantly killing them. I think that this is a fairly interesting effect as far as damage goes. Instant death is just damage with fewer steps. I have here my May of 1996 printing of the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, and on page 249 there's a very interesting spell, Power Word Kill. Don't worry, I'm not going to explain all of the spellcasting rules in AD&D 2nd Edition, this is just a comparison with a similar spell. Power Word Kill is a 9th level wizard spell, that is to say, it is among the most powerful spells in the game. It actually does not allow the target of the spell to even attempt a saving throw, unlike Disintegrate and Daggerfall, but there is one restriction to the spell. The target of Power Word Kill needs to have at most 60 hit points for a single creature, or 10 if you're targeting multiple creatures in an area, otherwise the spell doesn't work. Disintegrate has no such restriction. An enemy can die to disintegrate at any time, whether they are a rat or Daedra Lord, whether they are within a hair's breadth of shuffling off this mortal coil, or completely untouched. Frankly, this is just wild. Power Word Kill is of the highest spell level in the game, and Disintegrate is very expensive to cast, both marked as intended to be very powerful. I think that with these sorts of things, we're getting to the point where it's almost impossible to evaluate this from a game balance perspective. These are things that are very clearly intended to be overpowered as a reward for getting a spellcaster to high level. I'll get back to this point later. Next we have Drain, which should not be confused with the next effect, Transfer. Drain has only magnitude and allows you to select one of the 8 attributes. When you cast a Drain spell, you lower the target's attribute by the spell's magnitude. I have no experience with the spell effect. It is more expensive than damaging spells, so I've just never really messed around with it. After all, why drain my opponent's strength, potentially causing them to deal less damage when I can just deal damage to them? When I talked about Paralyze, I said that utility and control were, in my mind, the pinnacle of magic, yet now I say that I'd prefer damage. Why is that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Firstly, this is a destruction spell effect. If you have the skill to cast a reasonable drain spell, you can certainly cast a more than reasonable damage spell. This is due to the cost of the relevant spell effects. Again, the second reason is also related to the cost of the spell effects. In a tabletop role-playing game, you very often cast spells with spell slots, not spell points. All spells have fundamentally the same cost, a spell slot. In those games, it is very rare that a spell will deal enough damage by itself to actually kill an opponent. Because of that, you are rarely able to remove a threat in one turn with damage alone. If you cast a spell that controls your opponents, however, you may be able to mitigate or sometimes actually remove that threat with the one spell slot. Furthermore, in other games that use a blue bar to represent your spell points, it is rare that you'll be able to kill an opponent with one spell, which is why things like Polymorph and Hibernate are valuable in World of Warcraft, for example. In Daggerfall, you pretty much can kill an opponent with one spell, not just if you're using Disintegrate, but just by having a high damage spell. In Daggerfall, unlike other games, you also don't need to worry about conserving resources all that often. Usually time limits are generous enough that you can do a lot of resting inside dungeons. Part of why you want to use control in other games is because it is often resource efficient to do so. You can conserve resources for the next fight that way. In tabletop role-playing games and World of Warcraft, the other games that I brought up, those games are usually party-based. You have other people with you, fighting alongside. You do not have this advantage in Daggerfall, therefore you do not have anyone to deal damage with you once you've controlled the situation. Because of that, magical sources of damage are more valuable in Daggerfall in comparison to those games. All this is to say that I like the idea of draining my opponent's attributes, but due to the cost of the spell effect and sort of the nature of Daggerfall as a game, it just doesn't seem all that useful, and I've never felt that it was worth it. But like I've said, I've not used the effect very much, so I could totally be incorrect in my evaluation here. The final spell effect of the Destruction School is Transfer. Transfer comes with the options of all 8 attributes, as well as health and fatigue. It only has magnitude, no chance of success, or duration. A very nice thing about this spell effect is that it allows some health restoration on a character that might be specializing in destruction and not using restoration at all. The problem with the spell effect is, once again, its cost. I went to a test character with 40% each in Destruction and Restoration. I created 3 spells. The first was a healing spell, the second was a damaging spell delivered by touch, and the third was a transfer health spell also delivered by touch. All 3 spells had the exact same magnitude. The healing spell and damaging spell both cost 52 spell points to cast. How many spell points do you think the transfer health spell cost? Maybe 104 spell points, the addition of both of those spell effects together. Maybe a little bit more than that, as you have the advantage of bundling the 2 spell effects together. Maybe a little bit less than that, as the healing is contingent on the spell not being resisted after all. 192 spell points. It's just a shame, you know? It's a really cool spell effect, and I've made a lot of use of it in other games, but it's just not worth it in Daggerfall. Being almost 4 times as expensive as just dealing damage is just so excessive. Transferring an attribute is also kind of useless. It doesn't seem to increase your attributes at all if your attribute isn't already lowered by some other effect. And if you're being subjected to a poison or disease that's lowering your attributes, you're kind of going to be dead soon anyway. You need to get that cured. Daggerfall's successor, Morrowind, has a similar effect, Absorb. If you absorb an attribute, it will effectively fortify your attribute while lowering your target's attribute. This makes it a lot more useful. In Daggerfall, transfer attribute is only useful to you in very niche situations, as it will rarely increase your attribute. In Morrowind, it will always increase your attribute. So that's Destruction. It obviously focuses on offensive effects, but it has some amount of utility and defensive value in the form of Drain and Transfer. Damage and Continuous Damage are both solid choices for, well, dealing damage, and Disintegrate is pretty fun to mess around with, honestly. I could certainly talk more about all of those spell effects, but believe it or not, I am trying to keep this concise. Don't look at the video length, it scares me too. So we're moving on to the next school, Illusion. So Illusion is the smallest school of magic in Daggerfall, including only 4 spell effects, and 3 of them are very similar, so I'm going to start with the one that's different and move on to the other 3. The first spell effect of the School of Illusion is Light. You can create a magical candle that floats in front of you. This spell effect is cheap and has only duration, there is no chance or magnitude. It would be nice if there were a form of magnitude for this spell so you could control the brightness of the light, but the way that magnitude works in the Spellmaker wouldn't be very good for this effect. The light would automatically get brighter as you level, or the base magnitude would need to be a high value, thus making the spell cost too much. Personally, I've never really felt the need for the light spell, but I imagine that many people would get incredible use out of it. I'll put a demonstration of the light spell on screen now. It's a pretty significant increase in brightness, so if the darkness of dungeons in Daggerfall is a problem for you, maybe Illusion is the school of magic for you. Unless there is a malice to your stealth skill while you have a light effect active, which I don't really know how to test conclusively, there are no mechanical impacts of the light effect. But I don't think there need to be, and I don't think there are supposed to be. This is just a magical candle, and that's all it needs to be. There are obviously plenty of examples of this effect in other games. If you've ever played a fantasy role-playing game before, you've likely come across a torch. You've probably had a thought similar to, oh, a torch, now I can see in the dark, fantastic. And later you've probably had a thought similar to, oh, I can't hold a sword and a shield and a torch at the same time, I guess I drop my torch. Well, that's where a magical light comes in. It is good utility, and is another one of those magical effects that basically has to exist in a fantasy setting. Much better than reading books and by candlelight, assuming the magical light creates no heat or flame. The other 3 illusion effects are all very similar, and I'm just going to lump them all together. These 3 effects are Chameleon, Invisibility, and Shadow. While they all have minor differences, Chameleon and Shadow are essentially just worse, though cheaper, versions of Invisibility. All 3 of these effects have only duration, no chance or magnitude. They also each come in 2 variants, Normal and True. I'm just going to use the word Illusion to describe all 3 of these effects rather than listing them all each time. Normal illusions are broken by making an attack against an enemy, causing the spell to end. However, true illusions are not broken by attacking, allowing you to have free reign while under the effect. If you attack an enemy while affected by a true illusion, the enemy will still try to fight back, doing their best to figure out where you are by what direction you attacked from, but you can literally run circles around them to evade their attacks with relative ease. True illusions are not much more expensive than their normal counterparts, but significantly more powerful. If all you want from an illusion is to use it to sneak by enemies, then you don't really need to use a true illusion. However, if you want an illusion to increase your combat prowess, then true invisibility is perhaps the single best spell effect you can use. Generally, in other games, something like invisibility is restricted to the normal kind, where doing something significantly noticeable will cause the effect to end. If a true invisibility effect exists, it's usually more expensive and more restrictive in some way. Once again, referring to my player's handbook of AD&D 2nd edition, we have invisibility on page 184. Long story short, invisibility is a 2nd level wizard spell that lasts 24 hours or until the invisible creature makes an attack. On page 203, we have Improved Invisibility, a 4th level wizard spell. This one allows for the invisible creature to attack, but only lasts 4 rounds plus 1 round per level of the caster. So not only is Improved Invisibility a higher level spell and thus harder to cast, it also lasts significantly less time than normal invisibility. I think that a true invisibility effect absolutely should exist, but there need to be some restrictions on the effect. One restriction could be just making it more expensive, another could be reducing the duration of the spell by some means, a third, made possible in video games by an increase in computing power, would be a more in-depth mechanics allowing for the enemies to locate invisible characters. Improved hearing, tracking footprints, maybe even throwing a powder at the player like sand or flour, or a few ways to do so. Of course, the enemies shouldn't be too good at locating the player while invisible, otherwise the effect would feel too underpowered, but generally you want enemies, especially enemies that are people rather than animals or monsters, to feel competent. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say about Illusion. It is the smallest school after all, which is a bit of a shame. I like the other spell effects that are included in future installments of the franchise, like Fear and Sanctuary, but in Daggerfall the school is very small. Light can be useful if you find that the game is too dark, and all the illusions are solid options, especially the true variants. But now we're on to Mysticism, a much larger school. The first mysticism spell effect is Comprehend Languages. This effect has chance and duration. Comprehend Languages essentially adds to all of your language skills for its duration. If you're unaware, Daggerfall has language skills which are checked whenever an enemy that is governed by that skill becomes aware of you. If you succeed the check, the enemy is pacified, becoming non-hostile. Remember when I said there would be one time I'd refer to the code? Here it is. The formula to determine the chance of you successfully pacifying an enemy includes your skill in the relevant language, the attribute relevant to the language, either personality or intelligence, whether you have a weapon brandished or not, and the chance of any comprehend languages effect you have on. But all of that is added together and then divided by 200 to determine the actual rate of pacification. Thus, the chance of a comprehend languages effect working is actually half of what the chance property implies. To put it in simpler terms, if you have a comprehend languages spell that has a chance of 50, it actually only has a 25% chance to pacify an enemy. So this really should be a magnitude, not a chance of success property. This is an expensive effect, but its utility is rather high, especially at higher levels. A lot of enemies are governed by a language skill, and Comprehend Languages covers all of them. All of the most powerful enemies in the game are covered by a language skill. Human spellcasters and the sentient undead, liches, and vampires are covered by etiquette. Human thief-type enemies are covered by Streetwise, all Daedra are covered by the Daedric skill, Orc warlords and shamans are covered by the Orcish skill. The scariest enemy that isn't covered by a language skill is probably the Scorpion, which is pretty scary, but if that's the most powerful enemy you have to fight, you're in a good spot. The flavor of this spell effect is pretty on point as well. Magic for speaking languages is pretty ubiquitous in fantasy as well as in real history. There are 2 demons in the Ars Goetia alone that are supposed to be able to tutor one in languages and rhetoric. After all, learning languages is a pretty difficult thing to do, if only there were an easier way. Which brings us to today's sponsor. Nah, I'm just kidding. Yes, I did the exact same joke earlier in this very video, and I will not apologize. Whether you laughed at the joke or not, please leave a comment telling me that the joke was not funny. Thanks. Next up is Create Item, an effect that has only duration and is overcosted. It allows you to create any leather, chain, or steel plate armor piece, a steel buckler, battle axe, dagger, longsword, staff, or shortbow, as well as a random amount of arrows, or robes. You only get to choose one of these options, and have to cast the spell again if you want to get another item. So I like this effect. I think that it makes a lot of sense to have a spell that does this sort of thing, but the spell is just so expensive. I have made some use of this effect for creating arrows, as the duration doesn't matter so much for those, but if you're creating a piece of armor or weaponry, you probably want it to last for a while, and the duration is going to be a significant limiting factor. Unless, of course, you are a high level and can get a lot of duration out of the scaling portion of duration, but if you're a high level, what are you doing with steel equipment? The robes are a nice touch, I like that, very wizardly, but it isn't useful mechanically. While robes are great for enchanting, as they offer the largest base enchantment point budget of any clothing option, the robes are going to go away when the duration of the spell is up. Why put several thousand gold into a pair of robes that are going to disappear before you can even get to the dungeon you're making this item for? I really think that this effect simply does not work in Daggerfall with the way that spells function in this game. This is the sort of effect that should have a set duration, say 8 or 24 hours, or until you next sleep or travel. The next spell effect is Dispel, and this one's a bit weird. It has only chance, and you can choose between dispelling Daedra or Undead, or dispelling magic. Generally, Dispel magic is a good effect in these games, but it's weird that it shares this spell effect with what would be called in other games Banishment. In fact, the Cercinate spell that dispels Daedra is called Banish Daedra. So, when you cast Dispel Magic, you are presented with a list of spells that are affecting you, and choose one to attempt to dispel. When you dispel a Daedra or an Undead, they disappear without leaving a corpse. Dispel Daedra and Dispel Magic are priced equivalently, and Dispel Undead is a bit less expensive. So, the weird thing, in Daggerfall Unity, again, release version 1.1.1, there's no delivery mode for custom spells with the dispel effect. It just sort of happens, seemingly in an area around the caster. Anyway, as I said, dispel magic is always useful in these sorts of games, but the high cost to chance ratio is kind of unfortunate. I like that it dispels a single spell of your choice rather than dispelling all spells affecting you or one at random like this sort of spell does in some games. Dispelling enemies is a little strange though because you don't get any chance at loot, though the enemies you can dispel don't often have good loot in my experience. High level undead and Daedra both tend to just drop large quantities of money, though I think Daedra lords drop good stuff more often than other Daedra. I don't run into them often enough to know for sure. Lock is the next effect. It allows you to lock doors. It has only chance of success, no magnitude or duration. While this is a magical effect causing a door to be locked, it doesn't create a magical lock, meaning the door can still be picked open, or more importantly, bashed open. This spell effect is absolute trash, I have to come out and say it. Firstly, it isn't guaranteed to work. Secondly, it is very expensive. Thirdly, the door can be bashed open. Every enemy that isn't an animal has the ability to bash doors open, so unless you're playing Daggerfall as a vegan, this is at most a minor roadblock in the way of an enemy. And if you are playing as a vegan, I guess you have the option to lock an animal that's attacking you in a small room for an indefinite amount of time, and I'm not sure that's much better on the ethical front. Though, small side note, there is a YouTuber by the name of Poor Dunce that has been playing Oblivion and Skyrim as a vegan, and I thoroughly recommend those videos. I'll leave a link to that channel in the description. They've not yet played Daggerfall as a vegan, and I've considered taking up that challenge myself, as I think the restraints make an interesting playthrough. I guess let me know if you want to see that sort of thing. But yeah, lock is just a bad effect. It would be far better to spend your spell points on literally any spell that could help you evade or fight an enemy than by trying to put a locked door between you and them. I think that having a lock spell is really interesting in other games, but it just doesn't do anything for me in Daggerfall. It would be neat if the effect had magnitude, making the lock stronger, giving the door more hit points or something for it to resist being bashed down, but even then, I don't think it would be all that useful. And now for something completely similar, we have the open effect. It is also fairly expensive, though less expensive than a lock, and also only has chance. Unsurprisingly, it allows you to magically open locked doors, though not to open magically locked doors. Yeah, magically locked doors are basically this game's way of saying, yeah, you need to do the puzzle to unlock this, no ifs, ands, nor buts. It's an expensive spell effect, but if you're worried about alerting enemies and lockpicking failed you, it will let you get through a door without having to bash it open. The Cercinate open spell is one of the things that can be on random magic items, and I consider it to be a very good roll, as the main problem with this effect is the spell point cost associated with it. Much like Lock, I think that Open is a perfect spell effect for flavor. Plenty of other games have this same sort of effect. I like that there are multiple ways to approach a locked door in this game. Pick the lock, open it with magic, and if both of those fail, just bash the thing down. It's great. Silence is the next effect, having both chance and duration. Silence prevents the target from casting spells. It is a bit pricey, and you need to sort of split the cost between both chance and duration, making it a bit more expensive. Once you're of sufficient level, though, you don't really need to invest in the duration, as generally a spellcaster that can't cast spells is pretty easy to dispatch quickly, so even if the effect doesn't last very long, it should last long enough. Generally, spells are pretty good. Generally, characters that can cast spells are powerful because they can cast spells, so taking spells away from an opponent is generally pretty good. This effect is very powerful all across gaming. It is especially powerful because this isn't a symmetrical effect. After you cast Silence on your opponent, you still have free reign to cast other spells afterwards. I like this a lot. One of the traditional conceptions of magic in fantasy involves the use of words of power in order to wield the magic. So making a spellcaster unable to speak would eliminate most or all of their magical ability. If making another person unable to speak is a thing that magic can do in a setting, this is absolutely a thing that people would figure out how to weaponize in this way. The next spell effect is definitely the most horrifying, Soul Trap. If you remember the Enchanting section, which seems so long ago at this point, you'll remember that souls can be used to power enchantments. Well, this is how you get them. Soul Trap is pretty expensive and has both chance and duration. If the spell works and you kill the target within the duration, the soul will enter one of your unfilled soul traps. Other than mentioning the horrible ethical ramifications of this, I really don't have much to say about the spell effect. It doesn't really do anything for you by itself, it just allows you to make more powerful enchanted items later. That's good. Enchanted items are really good in this game. I should note that while soul traps that are filled with high level souls have an incredible gold value, you can't sell soul traps to anyone. This isn't a source of vast wealth. And now we have the final spell effect of the School of Mysticism and the single best spell effect in the entire game, the pièce de résistance, the reason to make a character able to cast spells, teleport. I'm not even joking, I've played several characters that only cast a teleport spell throughout their playthrough, and many more that only cast teleport, water breathing, and water walking. Teleport is the only spell effect in the game that doesn't have any of chance, duration, or magnitude. It simply is teleport, and that's all it needs to be. The spell effect is mid-priced, neither expensive nor inexpensive, and for what you get out of it, it could probably be 50% more or twice as expensive, and would still be totally okay. The way teleport works is whenever you cast it, you get a dialogue asking if you want to set an anchor or teleport. Whenever you choose to set an anchor, your position is saved. Whenever you choose to teleport, you recall back to your set anchor, and your anchor is removed. Generally, the way I use this effect is to set my anchor at whatever quest giver I have talked to, and then recall back to that quest giver once the quest is completed. But you can also set your anchor at the dungeon entrance if you want to be able to put loot in your wagon. Just remember that when you teleport, your anchor is removed, so you'd have to cast the spell again to set a new anchor if you did it that way. I don't think I even need to talk about this effect's flavor. I mean, it's teleportation. It obviously has incredibly high utility. This is an effect that is truly magical and cannot be achieved by any other means. This is a point that I will get back to later. So that's the Mysticism School. It has a couple of defensive options in the form of silence, comprehend languages, and dispel magic, an offensive option in the form of dispel Daedra and undead, and a bunch of utility options, some good, some less than good. Lock and create item are both a bit underwhelming, but open and soul trap are both nice to have, even if you don't want them in all playthroughs. And teleport is, well, teleport, my beloved. Next up is the School of Restoration. First in the Restoration School is Cure Disease, Paralysis, or Poison. Curing diseases and poisons is really impactful, and very valuable as those can be the death of you very quickly. Curing paralysis is totally useless because of the free action effect we'll talk about later. Cure has only chance of success and is pretty expensive. The fact that these spells only have a chance of success is pretty annoying, especially as diseases and especially poisons can be very lethal and kill you very quickly. You may spend all of your spell points attempting to cure yourself of your disease, fail each time, sleep to recover spell points to try again, and succumb to the illness in your sleep, never awakening. It is, however, incredibly necessary. Like I said, diseases and poisons are very lethal, and unless you have potions or magic items to cure them, you'll need to cast the spell, or to abandon the dungeon you're in and go to a temple, or reload a prior save, of course. Oh, and if you don't remember, Cure Disease is one of the spells that can't be put on a magic item. The next effect is Fortify Attribute. You select one of the 8 attributes, and it has duration and magnitude. It increases the selected attribute by the magnitude for the duration of the spell, but the fortification will never raise the attribute beyond 100, so this is an effect that is only really useful to shore up your weaknesses rather than improve upon your strengths. This effect can be a little expensive, but generally you don't need to pump the magnitude up too much once you get to higher levels, as even 2 per level would be, say, 20 strength at level 10. That means you can invest the spell's power into duration instead, and that's nice. This effect is obviously pretty good from a flavor standpoint. Being able to magically enhance an attribute like this is standard for fiction and has a lot of utility. Enhancing your speed and endurance to travel cross country, or enhancing your intelligence and luck to cheat at an exam, both are interesting ways a character could employ this sort of magic. Now we have Free Action. The spell effect that I mentioned made Cure Paralysis useless earlier. Free Action has only duration. It allows you to move and attack despite being paralyzed. It's also incredibly cheap. So curing your paralysis is relatively expensive and only has a chance of working. Casting Free Action technically does not cure your paralysis, but it lets you act as though you aren't paralyzed. Secondly, if you cure your paralysis, you could just get paralyzed again, whereas if you're under the effect of Free Action, even if you get paralyzed again, it doesn't matter because you can move around. Technically, if the paralysis effect lasts a very long time, you could go through the entire duration of free action before the paralysis effect wears off, thus becoming paralyzed once again. But free action is cheap, so you can just cast it again if you need to. Honestly, I don't really get this effect very much from a flavor standpoint. I mean, I guess that magic could let you move despite being paralyzed, but it just seems weird. Surely this should just be a use of the cure disease slash cure poison effect, or a dispel magic effect. Personally, I just don't get this effect. It's obviously pretty useful. Being paralyzed in a combat situation is bad. This is just a weird magical effect to me. Next, we have the crown jewel of the Restoration School, Heal. You can heal health, fatigue, or any attribute. This effect has only magnitude, and the cost is, once again, a little weird. Generally, the effect is very cheap, though healing an attribute is more expensive. And interestingly, the base magnitude portion of the attribute healing version is far more expensive than the scaling value in comparison to healing health or fatigue. What can I say? It's healing magic. It's really good. Mechanically, it is very useful to get health and fatigue back without resting, and as far as flavor goes, it's great. I've always loved playing healers in role playing games. Of the holy trinity of roles in RPGs, healer is my favorite. I vastly prefer it over playing a defender or damage dealer type character. I have to shout out Mini Healer, a wonderful little game that I've had a lot of fun with. I'll leave a link to that game in the description. Next up is Regenerate, which only restores health, no fatigue or attribute option like with Heal. It has duration as well as magnitude. This spell effect heals your health for its magnitude when you cast the spell and each round for the spell's duration. And this spell effect's cost? Well, it's cheap as hell. As long as you don't touch the base duration, which is very expensive, and keep it at 1, your regeneration spell will be super cheap. I actually made a heal health spell that had a magnitude of 10 plus 10 per level and got a spell point cost of 109. The same character made a regenerate spell with the same magnitude, but the duration was 1 round plus 10 rounds per level, and the spell point cost was 104, a discount. So yeah, it's not even a matter of spell point efficiency. Sometimes an identical regenerate spell, disregarding the duration portion, would just be less expensive than a heal spell. The culprit here is the scaling portion of magnitude for the heal effect being significantly more expensive than the scaling portion of magnitude for the regenerate effect. Because the spell heals when you cast it, you don't even need to wait for the round to tick over for your healing, and if you want, you can just recast the regenerate spell to heal yourself if you're in dire straits. As far as flavor goes, I really like the effect across gaming. It tends to make you feel like an inexorable juggernaut with time on your side. I like being able to win a confrontation by accumulating small advantages over a protracted engagement. I am a blue player at heart, after all. The final spell effect in the Restoration School is Spell Absorption. It has chance and duration and is very expensive. When you are hit by an opponent's spell within the duration of the spell, and you have spell points missing equal to or greater than the cost of that spell, you have a chance to absorb the spell, nullifying all of its effects and regaining the spell points of that spell. Recovering spell points is very valuable, and in a sort of twisted way, the high cost of spell absorption is sort of an upside, because you need to be missing spell points in order to successfully absorb a spell, regardless of the chance of the spell effect. Casting an expensive spell absorption spell will mean that you have plenty of missing spell points, which means that you can absorb spells. I guess that's kind of neat. Not only does this effect let you regain spell points, which is incredibly powerful, it also provides a chance to completely resist incoming spells, which is also incredibly powerful. There is an argument to be made as to which of these consequences of the spell absorption effect is greater. Honestly, I think that in normal gameplay, the regaining of spell points is probably the better half of this equation, though at high levels, enemy spells can one-shot characters that have low health totals. I think that this is a very interesting spell effect. I find that the idea of having such a mastery of magic that not only can you totally resist an opponent's spell, but that you can redirect its energies to refill your magical power banks, I think that's fascinating. I do, however, think that it is strange that this effect belongs to the School of Restoration. I get that it restores your spell points, but I still think it's a weird placement. It seems to me that this sort of effect belongs to any of the Alteration, Mysticism, or Thaumaturgy schools more than Restoration. It just seems like a classification error to me. Anyway, that's the Restoration School. Quite good spell effects are to be found here. Free action is basically necessary for any character that isn't immune to paralysis. Heal and regeneration are both incredibly useful. Spell absorption is frankly absurd in both defensive capability and utility. Diseases and poisons both are very dangerous, and the ability to cure them prevents a lot of reloading. Fortify attribute is a bit of an odd duck, but can be useful on occasion. So, now we're on to the final of the six schools of magic, thaumaturgy. So I am once again going to lump together multiple effects, those being charm and pacify. These are both effects that have only chance, no duration or magnitude, and they also both cause enemies to be pacified, rendered non-hostile, on a successful cast. Now, the charm spell effect targets human enemies, whereas the pacify spell effect has the options of animals, Daedra, humanoids, or undead. So, humans versus humanoids. This is probably why these are two different spell effects. These words do not refer to the same class of enemies. Humans are the enemies that have player classes, your monks, warriors, healers, acrobats, etc. Humanoid enemies are things like orcs, centaurs, giants, harpies, etc. So charm works on people, and pacify humanoid works on what the people of Tamriel consider to be intelligent monsters. Okay, so I get that this is a conceit of game design, but this is really weird. I think that there is a very interesting conversation to be had here around this interaction of magic and the societal implications thereof. I really don't want to go too deep into the weeds here, but I'm going to take a short digression. Y'all fuckers have listened to me yap enough, I'm sure you're willing to take more of this shit. I say that with affection, of course. Thanks for sticking around. So if charm works on people and it doesn't work on orcs, say, what does that mean? Is there some law of magic that determines which races are fully people? But then later on in the franchise in Morrowind, orcs are accepted as people rather than intelligent monsters, even if they're still discriminated against. And in Morrowind, the relevant spell effects do affect orcs, as they would Bosmer, Nords, or Cyrodiils, so does that mean that the spell effect somehow taps into the legal status of a given race? Or does it feed off of the caster's own biases? But on the other paw, what few intelligent monsters there are in Morrowind, mostly Reeklings and Goblins in the two expansions, are affected by the same spell effect, Calm Humanoid. So does that just mean that the Charm and Pacify Humanoid spell effects have been merged? What does it all mean? Anyway, like I said, I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had here about racism, magic, society, and all of the interactions thereof when it comes to world building, but I think that I am neither qualified nor willing to do justice to this sort of conversation, especially in a video that's not about that topic. So back to the spell effect. Charm and each of the variants of Pacify are all priced differently. Charm is actually the cheapest, which is a bit interesting. I'll put a demo on screen. Pause the video if you really want to take in the data. Long story short from this demo, though, is that all of the spell point costs are different, sometimes in weird ways, like the base chance of Pacify Daedra being really low cost compared to everything else. The only two that share a cost is Pacify Humanoid and Pacify Undead. Anyway, I think that this is a neat spell effect. I've made a lot of use of it in other games, but in Daggerfall I've never really liked it all that much. It competes with comprehend languages for almost every use case. The first advantage of Pacify is that you can pacify animals and low-level undead. That simply isn't useful at all except at low levels, but at low levels this spell effect is going to be far too expensive to rely on. The second advantage to Pacify and Charm is that you can try it over and over again, whereas your language skill is only ever checked when the enemy becomes aware of you. I guess that's nice. It just seems like there are probably better things to do with your spell points. Next up, we have Detect Enemy, Magic, or Treasure. I'm going to be honest, I've got no idea about this one. It only has duration, is neither expensive nor inexpensive, and it apparently allows you to detect those things. I played Daggerfall in the objectively correct way, that is to say that I use the full user interface, and the spell effect does not work unless you're in full screen mode. I guess it will point you to enemies, but when I have tried to use it, the range seems incredibly low to the point where it is almost useless. I only on occasion forget where treasure piles are, so that's not all that useful to me, and honestly, I don't know what it means by detecting magic. I went to Shedungent and Scourge Barrow to see if it would flag either the lich that you can tell to shut up to open the door, or the tapestry you can click on to levitate, and detect magic flagged neither. There are no Cercinate spells with this effect, so honestly, it just seems like something the developers never finished the implementation of. The idea of being able to locate things with magic is pretty cool, I just wish it were more useful. Identify is next, having only chance and being rather expensive. This effect allows you to identify magic items. When you cast a spell, it opens up an inventory menu where you are free to add as many unidentified items as you like to attempt to identify. It then rolls for each one independently. It's nice that you can try identifying multiple items with a single casting, potentially saving you some spell points. This is the kind of spell where it doesn't really matter how expensive it is, though, as you are probably not going to be casting this while you're dungeon diving. Identifying magic items at the Mage's Guild can get pretty expensive, so this spell can save you a good bit of cash. You don't need to have an item identified to use it, which I think is really unfortunate from a game design standpoint. I think that doing such a thing should incur great risk. Magic is a strange and powerful thing, and using it ignorantly should be dangerous. But that isn't the case in this game. You can use unidentified magic items with no downside. Next, we have Levitate, an effect that is reasonably priced and only has duration. I actually tend to make the spell last as little time as I can, as you move at a set speed when levitating, and that's usually rather slow compared to your normal walking speed. And typically, you don't need to levitate for very long. I mean, yeah, this is magical flight. Very good. I like it. It is pretty slow, though, less powerful than this effect is in some other games where flight is fast. You can't use it to get away from enemies very well unless you have somewhere above you that is safe, but that isn't all that common in this game. The next spell effect is Spell Reflection. It has chance and duration and is very expensive. For the duration of the spell, you have a chance to not only resist an incoming spell, but also to send the spell back at the caster. This is an incredible show of magical prowess, much like spell absorption is, and the fantasy of being able to redirect spells like this is incredible. I love the idea of a wizard being of such incredible skill and knowledge that they can manipulate magic like this. Similarly, we have spell resistance. This is cheaper than spell absorption and spell reflection, but is still a relatively expensive effect. It has chance and duration. For the duration of the spell, you have an extra chance to resist incoming spells. There's no benefit to using this spell effect over spell reflection or spell absorption, except in some minor ways, other than it being a less expensive option, which is obviously valuable. Firstly, for spell absorption, you do need to have missing spell points in order to absorb the spell, so spell resistance beats it out if you're at high spell points. Maybe you cast the spell from a magic item or drink a potion of restore power after casting it. For spell reflection, you may want to kill the target yourself rather than letting it kill itself. Maybe you are looking for a soul to trap and don't want Daedra lords killing themselves on your spell reflection before you can cast soul trap. But yeah, spell resistance is great. If you don't care about the benefits that spell absorption or reflection give you, then spell resistance is certainly a valuable spell to have. Like I've said several times now, spells are good, so resisting them is also good. And the final spell effect of the School of Thaumaturgy, and thus the final spell effect of them all, is that of Water Walking. Water Walking is a cheap effect with only duration. Contrary to the name, this spell effect makes you swim quickly for its duration. I guess it makes you walk through the water rather than on top of it. It's a bit weird to me. I would think that the schools of water breathing and water walking should be swapped. Water walking, which is really swift swim, should be in alteration with climbing and jumping, and water breathing should be in thaumaturgy with the weird stuff like spell reflection and detect. I don't know, that just sort of passes the vibe check for me better, but maybe that's just me. Yeah, like I said about the alteration mobility spells, this is a great effect and makes perfect sense for a magical character to learn. So that's thaumaturgy. A lot of interesting spell effects in this school. Charm and pacifier, an interesting way to approach the game. Identify, levitate, and water walking offer incredible utility to the point where I consider them almost essential effects. Spell reflection and spell resistance are incredibly powerful and well worth consideration for their defensive capability. And detect is, I think, unfortunately unfinished and is an effect that just needed some more work. So those are all the spell effects in Daggerfall. Most of them I spoke positively about. They're mostly good, mostly interesting, and most of the ones that I spoke negatively about have incredible flavor and storytelling potential or are useful in other games, but the implementation in Daggerfall is just weird. I think that this list of spell effects is an incredible roster and would be serviceable in any fantasy RPG. Of course, there is plenty of room for improvement. I mean, it is magic after all. The limits are boundless. Can you believe I'll get back to this point later? Has this bit gotten annoying yet? Probably. Anyway, let's get back to story time. Yay, story time! Soon, the time had come. There was not much time left before Girl with Book's opportunity would escape. She was confident in her skills and willing to pay the cost, both monetary and moral. It was the end of Sun's Dawn, and the 5th of First Seed, the summoning day of Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric prince whose sphere of influence was knowledge and secrets, would be soon upon her. Girl with Book took out a loan of 50,000 gold, a very large sum, but she was certain she could repay it in time. She had no hatred for the gods who had cursed her so as a child. She simply wished to know why. She wasn't sure that this was knowledge that was within the purview of anyone other than the divines themselves. But if anyone had this secret, it would be Hermaeus Mora. With the help of the Mages Guild, she besought the Dark God for aid, seeking this certainly forbidden knowledge. A vision forced itself into the forefront of Girl with Book's mind, an unimaginable terror, an infinite expanse of starlight, an anechoic, crushing darkness, all too bestial, all too human, a writhing mass of tendrils, the Daedric Prince of Secrets in all its glory. And then it spoke.
Power, yes, is an elusive but eloquent prosecution. One of my minions possesses an ancient tome called the Ogma Infinium, which bequeaths great power on those who read its pages. If you exterminate a certain scrofulous patrician who has aroused my displeasure, I will arrange a meeting between you and the book. Is this agreeable?
Girl with Book sputtered out an affirmative.
Very well. This socialite I referred to resides at the Palace of Oxford. For the record, the name of your quarry is Edwin Morton. Kill him, and proceed to Aldingbone Commons, where my servant Elizola Ashwing will wait for you in a library. I do not think there is anything to be gained by continuing this interview. Fail me not in this, girl, and the power thou craves will be thine.
Of all the disagreeable things a dark god might ask a supplicant, a simple murder was rather tame. Girl with Book braced herself for the foul deed she was to commit, wiping off the blood which had leaked from her eyes, ears, and nose. She traveled to Oxford Palace and did the deed. She held some remorse, of course, but she had a goal, and she valued that goal more than the life of some noble. She took some comfort in Hermaeus Mora's description implying that this noble wasn't of the ethical sort, though who could know what that would mean to a Daedra. Girl with Book met with the servant of Hermaeus Mora and received the Ogma Infinium, a book of great knowledge and power. She went to the library of the Mages Guild, a quiet and safe place to read and to contemplate. She opened the book, meditating on her question. Why had the gods cursed her as they had? And she got her answer. There was no reason. The gods are capricious and fickle, their whims unpredictable. They act without intention. The world is the way it is because that is how it is. There is no meaning of life, nor of her, nor of her struggle. The weight of the misotheistic nihilism nearly crushed her heart. She wanted, desperately, to wriggle out from under it, but it was true. She knew it to be true. And now, Girl with Book had a dilemma, an ultimatum, really. Succumb to the nihilism and be done with it all now, or find her own meaning. She delved into her weakened heart, finding that she could, in fact, find value in life, improvement, and learning. These were the things she had found. She had found meaning in her growth, in her skills being honed. She vowed then to become the most powerful mage she could be. And then, she'd figure something else out, take things one at a time, or break under the weight. So I wanted to take a brief moment, at least for some definition of the term brief, to talk about a couple of the other services that the Mages Guild provides, starting with Daedra summoning. Now, I'm actually not going to be talking about the individual Daedric quests or artifacts that you acquire from summoning Daedra, except for the Ogma Infinium, which Girl with Book just received. I'm just going to be talking about the actual Daedra summoning itself, as well as the idea of artifacts. Suffice it to say, most, though not all, of the Daedric artifacts you can get are just items enchanted with powers you could add yourself to a normal item, though without any side effects. The Ogma Infinium is a one-time use book that you can read. Upon doing so, you are presented with the level up screen. While it doesn't actually increase your level at all, it gives you a massive 30 points to distribute into your various attributes. If you don't know, increasing your character's level by 1 gives you 4 to 6 points to increase your attributes, so this is about 6 levels worth of attribute points. I really do enjoy the idea that there are dark gods that players might beseech for their favor, and that there are famous items that those dark gods award to those who do their bidding. The lore of these artifacts always include the fact that these artifacts to some degree have a will of their own and don't take kindly to serving the same individual for very long. This is 100% an explanation as to why the player character can get these items in multiple different games, but it's also just really neat, an idea that I love. I think that there are so many interesting stories that can be told based off of this premise alone, and so many more that can incorporate this premise as a significant piece of its storytelling. While it is certainly the case that such artifacts often end up being MacGuffins in stories, I don't think that they need to end up that way, and I certainly believe that tales of these sorts of items could be stories within stories that add some wonder to a world. I think that the Ogma Infinium in particular, a book of boundless knowledge, is a particularly interesting option. Many people would go to great lengths to acquire such an object, and they could hardly be blamed for doing so. There's also the matter of knowledge being something which can be transmitted. What prevents the receiver of the magic book from sharing the knowledge they acquire from it? Surely there must be something that prevents them from doing so, lest the value of said book itself be rendered redundant. But that's enough of the flavor for now, onto the mechanics of Daedra summoning. I find that these are also fairly interesting. There are a couple of different ways to summon Daedra in Daggerfall. The first method, the method that Girl with Book used, is to use the Mages Guild or temples to perform Daedra summoning. The second method is to use witch covens. Summoning Daedra at the Mages Guild or a temple is the safer, though more restrictive option. Each Daedric prince has their own day dedicated to them, their summoning day. For example, Hermaeus Mora's summoning day is the 5th of First Seed. The Mages Guild and temples can only summon Daedric princes on their own summoning days, with the exception of the Daedric prince here seen, which the guild and temples cannot summon on any day. When you decide you want to summon a Daedric prince, you must give upwards of 200,000 gold to the Daedra summoner, and then you have a chance of successfully summoning the Daedric prince. The cost in gold is determined by your reputation with the summoner. One thing that must be kept in mind is that the summoners of the Mages Guild and the temples are members of their own sub-factions, not members of the guild or temple proper. Actually, the UESP page on Daedra summoning, as of this writing, incorrectly says that the Daedra summoners at the Mages Guild are faction members of the Mages Guild directly and thus offer lower price Daedra summoning rather than being members of the Cabal. This is incorrect. They are, in fact, members of the Cabal, and your Mages Guild reputation is not what is used to determine the price of the summoning. The UASP page on the Mages Guild itself does indeed correctly say that your reputation with the Cabal is what determines the price of Daedra summoning. I want to say that it could be that a bug in Daggerfall Classic makes this true, and that bug is fixed in the Unity recreation. I remember it being the case in Classic that the Cabal had its own reputation, but I haven't tested it recently. Once you've paid the gold cost, you have a chance of summoning the Daedric Prince in question. You also have a chance of Shegarath, Daedric Prince of Madness and Chaos, showing up instead, just for fun. The chance of a successful summoning depends on your reputation with the relevant Daedric Prince and sometimes the weather. Some Daedric Princes like the rain and Shegarath likes thunderstorms. Assuming you roll a successful summoning, you will be presented with that Daedric Prince, who will offer you a quest in exchange for the artifact they possess. Should you say no to this quest, the prince will be angered at your insolence and send Daedra enemies at you. I think they tend to be Daedra lords, but maybe there isn't any bias in the selection. If you are at a witch coven, only a few things change, but they are important changes. Firstly, you can attempt to summon a Daedric Prince on any day, not just the summoning days. However, each day the Daedric Prince the summoner will offer to summon is selected randomly. Furthermore, on any unsuccessful summon, as well as any successful one in which you refuse the quest, you will be assaulted by the Daedra. There is also the matter of the Glenmoral Witches' Coven. Remember when I said that you couldn't summon Hircine at the guild or temples? Well, the Glenmoral Witches summon Hircine every day. Shegarath can still intercept that summoning, though. The main problem with witch covens is the difficulty with which one might find them. There are only so many on the map, 14 of them. There are also some weird ones that exist in houses in towns, but those are due to a bug and are all of the Glenmoral Witches faction specifically. Lycanthropes will be pointed to the Glenmoral Witches should they seek a cure for their condition. There are a paw full of quests in the game that are at least supposed to be able to give you maps to various covens around the place. Other than that, you would have to be in a province that has a coven and get lucky enough with random maps. Okay, back to flavor. These mechanics are great for flavor. Mechanically, it is infuriating that you can spend upwards of 200,000 gold and only get some Daedra attacking you for your trouble, but the flavor and storytelling is fantastic. Imagine being the guy that spends 125,000 gold to try to summon a Daedric Prince, only for them to not pick up the phone, and now you have to wait a whole year to spend 125,000 more gold to try calling them again. Imagine spending so much time and effort trying to get into contact with the Daedric Prince, but because it wasn't raining on the 16th of Sun's Dawn that year, Sanguine won't go out for a drink with you. Or worse yet, calling up Hircine for a wild night with that big, hunky deer boy, and instead going for wine and cheese with Shegarath, who frankly cannot hold a conversation. Obviously, I'm playing with these examples, but in seriousness, the artifacts that the Daedric Princes offer are of such incredible value that missing out on them when one has invested so much into acquiring them would likely drive many people into utter desperation, and there are so many interesting stories that can be told centering that experience. Witch covens being hard to find is pretty neat. I kinda like that. This is something that really depends on the setting that you're engaging with. It is also interesting, for example, for witches to be ubiquitous, and depending on exactly what kind of setting you're in, may be an ever-present danger to the good, upstanding citizens of whoever the people that decide what kind of magic is legitimate are. I find it very interesting that the temples also offer Daedra summoning as a service. While the religions of Tamriel are almost universally polytheistic and often highly syncretic, usually the divines and the Daedra are considered to be very separate. Often, worship of the divines as a group is considered proper, whereas worship of the Daedra as a group is considered improper. However, the fact that temples allow for the summoning of the Daedric princes in Daggerfall implies that perhaps there's more syncretism here than future installments of the franchise may imply. I could bloviate on about this for a long while, but in the interests of keeping this video some amount of time that's reasonable, I guess, I will go on to the other services that the Mages Guild provides. Since we've already talked about spells, buying magic items and soul traps, enchanting and Daedra summoning, there are four, well, kind of five services that the guild provides. I guess I'll start with the kind of fifth. At a high rank, you get access to the guild 24 hours a day. This is convenient. It also sort of implies that there are mages that prefer to use the guild only after hours when the low-ranking members aren't allowed to enter. It gives the impression that the guild has a lot of elitist members that don't want to mingle with those lesser than them, which is probably true, so I guess that's cool. Also shitty, but. I mentioned this service earlier, but I didn't talk about it very much. The Mages Guild offers the identification of magical items for a price. I think that this is really interesting. I know that this is certainly a conceit of game design, but every single Mages Guild throughout the entire Iliac Bay region has a person, or maybe two, given the after hours NPCs, that has, at least as part of their duties, identifying magic items for any person, member or not, who enters the guild. How many random magic items are floating around that this is a necessary service? Any member of the Mages Guild that has the class disadvantage inability to regenerate spell points can, by speaking to any NPC in the guild, have their spell points replenished. I find this kind of interesting as well. By default, the only pre-made class that has the class disadvantage is the Sorcerer, which also has the Spell Absorption class advantage. For sorcerers, this spell point recharging could be explained by the NPC casting benign spells on you until your spell point stores are replenished. But if you make a custom class with that disadvantage, you needn't take spell absorption. So how does it work then? I think that the only reasonable conclusion from an in-universe perspective is that there are magical items that have the capability to restore spell points. We know that there are potions that can do it, but the Mages Guild doesn't deal in potions in Daggerfall. I could see the guild purchasing stores of potions of restore power for their members, but those are kind of expensive, and the spell point recharge service is free. I guess this could be a kindness of the guild, and perhaps taking advantage of this kindness would eventually get you cut off. If it is not the case that the guild purchases stores of potions to regenerate spell points, we get back to the idea that there are magical items that can do so. If this is the case, why can the player not acquire them? Are they simply too bulky to carry around? Are they simply too valuable for anyone to be trusted with them? If it is because of the item's value, we get back to the fact that every guild in the Iliac Bay region has access to one, and that seems like it would be a lot of money, and that calls into question just how powerful the institution of the Mages Guild is. The next thing that you get access to is the Mages Guild Library. You actually get access to this at pretty low rank. This is a bizarre service that the guild offers, not because it is strange that the Mages Guild has a library or archive, but just because books in the Elder Scrolls world are really weird. So books are really valuable, not just in real history, but also in Daggerfall. As far as items go, books are generally worth several hundred gold, sometimes as much as 600 gold for one book. This is a good reflection of the value of books in medieval Europe, upon which most fantasy is based. The weird thing is the prevalence of public libraries in Daggerfall. They're certainly not the most common type of shop, which libraries technically count as in Daggerfall, but there are quite a few of them throughout the Iliac Bay. The history of public libraries is neat, but not within the scope of this video. Suffice it to say, due to the value of books, public libraries do not become super common until relatively modern times. It would be very interesting if the libraries in Daggerfall were chained libraries, which I think would be a little bit more believable, but as far as I can tell, there isn't any evidence that they are. Other than the inability to steal books from the library, I guess, I'm going to put a small clip of the library on screen. Looking at the shelves of the library, it could be the case that maybe this is a chained library. There is a gap between how far the side of the shelves stick out from where the books are on the shelf, and there could theoretically be glass protecting the books here, but that's probably not the case, and we certainly don't see any way to open the glass case. There's also a dark strip at the bottom of the whole shelf that could be a place for chains to attach to, but it probably is not. Also, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any confirmation as to whether or not the printing press has been invented and or yet seen widespread adoption in Tamriel. The sheer quantity of books, especially those that aren't directly of economic, historical, or religious value, implies to me that the printing press has been invented. Well, actually, I was going to say just that and leave it, but then I remembered that there is a quest in the Tribunal expansion of Morrowind about a certain tract being printed, and it uses the word printed to describe the creation of it. However, when you discover this tract's origin, there isn't a printing press in sight. In fact, the inkwells and blank paper seem to indicate that it is not a printed work, but a handwritten one. I do not know what conclusion to draw from this. I will leave it as an exercise for the viewer. The final service that the Mages Guild offers is relegated only to the highest ranking members, and that is the teleportation service. This allows you to, for free, instantly teleport to any location you know of on the world map from any Mages Guild. This is a one-way trip, there is no return. This honestly isn't all that useful in Daggerfall because you rarely need to save any time or money with travel. The in-universe implications are astounding, however. Generally, teleportation has some limitations to it. The portal must be two-way. There must be a pre-existing teleportation circle at the destination, or otherwise is limited in destination. It costs a lot of money or magical power, maybe, but in Daggerfall, this just doesn't seem to be the case. The Travelers League can just send you anywhere at any time for free. It could be the case, though, that this is a costly service provided to the player for free due to their dedication and service to the guild. But anyway, those are all of the other services that the Mages Guild offers, all of which Girl with Book now has access to. Speaking of, let's check back in with her. After Girl with Book did a few more jobs for the Mages Guild to pay off her loan, she cast her mind back to the advice that Morgaya had given her over a year ago. She had still not gotten an inn at Castle Daggerfall, and so it was time to approach someone of lesser station. She met with Sindasa, a maid. She asked Girl with Book to hunt down a werewolf for her and put it out of its misery. At this point, this was a trivial task for Girl with Book, and in exchange Sindasa put in a good word with the Queen Dowager, Minnesera. So she met with Minnesera. Minnesera said that she had never received the letter addressed to her, and tasked Girl with Book with finding the courier, a knight of the dragon, that had supposedly delivered it. She went and met that courier after speaking with another knight who told Girl with Book that the letter was addressed to the Queen of Daggerfall, who, at the time the courier had arrived in Daggerfall, was Obki, not Minnesera. Girl with Book was surprised at this uncharacteristic carelessness of the Emperor. Uriel Septim VII was a diplomatic man, and with a keen mind for intrigue. She had seen this firsthand in her acquaintanceship with the man. Minnesera informed Girl with Book that the letter had managed to make its way into the hands of Gortwog, king of the orcs, and asked Girl with Book to retrieve it from Orsinium, Gortwog's stronghold. She arrived in Orsinium and met with Gortwog. He told Girl with Book that she was free to take the letter, so long as she had the skill to get to it. She braved the depths of Orsinium and found the letter. The orcs in her way were no match for her, and she retrieved the letter. She recalled to Minnesera, and she told Girl with Book that the letter was dangerous, revealing that the totem of Tiber Septim had been located, and that it was in the possession of Lord Woodbourne of Wayrest, who would, no doubt, lose it soon. The totem of Tiber Septim is an artifact of immense power and must be returned to Imperial possession. Girl with Book didn't have any leads for this particular problem, as she doubted the nobles of Wayrest would assist her in finding this Lord Woodbourne, and she knew not his location. She cast her mind back to another piece of information she had gathered, that of Medora Dureni, lover of the late King Lysandus, and her tower on the Isle of Balfiera. Though, strangely, she could not recall where she had learned this information. She traveled to the tower and found Dureni trapped within, cursed to be unable to leave. In order to free her, she would need the horn of a great unicorn, and Dureni said that one could be found in Shedungent, the home of Nulfaga, Lysandus's mother. Girl with Book traveled to the Rothgarian mountains and to Shedungent, searching the depths of the castle for this unicorn horn. She found it and returned to Dureni, who then tasked her with finding the dust of restful death, telling her that Gortwog could point her to it. Little did Dureni know the dust could be found on her very own Isle of Balfiera. Girl with Book was getting rather tired of all this playing fetch, especially now that her skills had gotten to the point where she was rarely challenged in doing so. After finding the dust of restful death and it being cleansed by Dureni, Girl with Book went to the tomb of Lysandus, his true resting place, which had been revealed to her by the King of Worms. She found Lysandus's coffin and sprinkled the dust of restful death on his corpse. But Lysandus would not be placated. He wanted revenge on Lord Woodbourne, the man who had slain him. For Lysandus did not die at the Battle of Cringane, as most believed. He had been murdered beforehand. Lysandus revealed the location of Woodbourne Hall to Girl with Book, and so she soon set out. Girl with Book fought through Woodbourne Hall and found Lord Woodbourne, who admitted that he killed the King Lysandus. In his last words he said that his plan was now left to Gothrid, King of Daggerfall. A week later, Girl with Book got a letter from Brissiena once again, asking for another meeting. When they met, Lady Magnesson told Girl with Book that the Blades had assaulted Woodbourne Hall in search of the totem of Tiber Septim, and that their search had borne no fruit. She suspected that it would be located in the vaults of Castle Daggerfall. The Blades were too low on manpower to mount another siege, and Girl with Book had proven herself capable of infiltrating castles, so Brissiena tasked her with retrieving the totem. Girl with Book once again consigned herself to infiltrating a castle and departed for Daggerfall. Once in the castle, just as in Castle Wayrest, she became invisible to evade the guards, quickly finding the vault. She grabbed the Totem of Tiber Septim without bloodshed. After doing so, she received letters from Gortwog, the King of Worms, the Underking, and, eventually, Brissiana, all asking that Girl with Book deliver the totem into their care. She felt compassion for the orcs who had long been mistreated under imperial law, and she understood the Underking's plight, but she had seen firsthand what a weakened empire would do back in Snowhawk during the imperial simulacrum and the War of the Bendermach, and she knew that the Totem of Tiber Septim must be returned to imperial control such that those horrors might never repeat. So she met with Brissiana one last time to return the Totem of Tiber Septim to her. Remember all the times throughout the video where I promised that I would get back to it later? Well, here we are. This entire video ultimately boils down to a paw full of questions. What is magic? And why do you want magic in your game or in your story? What is magic? Magic is something which is impossible to define and is bounded only by the imagination of the storyteller or game developer. If we wanted to try to define the word magic, the best definition that I can think of would be something along the lines of a temporary suspension of the laws of nature in order to reshape reality in accordance with the whims of the magic practitioner. This definition is pretty clunky, and it isn't even all that good, but it's kind of the best I have. Like I said, it's a hard word to define, much like the word furniture. Any definition of magic will end up either including things which should be excluded, or exclude things which should be included. Why do you want magic in your game or in your story? Well, presumably the reason you'd want magic as a part of game design or in your story is for that suspension of natural law. You want magic in a game or story to have a mechanism by which the impossible can be achieved. And yet, magic that can simply do anything at any time is fundamentally uninteresting, which brings us to another few questions. What can magic do? What can magic not do? And how is magic employed? Magic is a fascinating aspect of game design and storytelling precisely for these questions. On the one paw, magic needs to be able to do the impossible. On the other, it must not be able to accomplish anything. Magic needs to feel magical, but it also needs restraints. From a mechanical standpoint, a game designer shouldn't want magic to be overpowered, and from a storytelling standpoint, a storyteller wants magic to remain interesting. When you're telling a story about magic, you don't want magic to feel like it is only a plot device, even if it is only a plot device. We, as game players, need to have an ability to understand magic, what it can do for us, what it can do when used against us, if we are to have an appreciation for the underlying mechanics. Likewise, as those engaging with a story, we need to have a similar understanding of magic in order to appreciate the storytelling. What does it mean for magic to feel magical in a video game? Well, it isn't just the stuff that uses your blue bar. Magic needs to be able to accomplish things which are otherwise impossible in the game. I'm going to bring back the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim as an example, unfortunately, as an example of what not to do. In Skyrim, magic fundamentally feels non-magical to me. So many spells in Skyrim do something for you that can be accomplished by non-magical means. You can cast Stone Flesh, or you can just wear armor. Summoning a Daedra to fight for you is cool, but you can just get a companion. In fact, the main quest forces one on you pretty early on. You can deal damage with magic, but it isn't very good damage usually, and your blue bar recovers slower than your green one. You can cast healing spells, but you're better off drinking a liter or 7 of vegetable soup. I want to take a moment to appreciate the single school of magic in Skyrim that I think is great, and that is the school of illusion. It is the school that most consistently gives you options that you don't have without magic. Effects like calm, fear, and fury are things that you can't do without magic, and they're really cool. The most fun I've had with magic in Skyrim has been by using those effects. Skyrim does have a few effects that you can only get with magic, but a disappointingly small number of them, several of those added in the expansions rather than being present in the base game. Magic just doesn't feel very good in Skyrim. I've never had fun in Skyrim trying to make magic the core of my playstyle, and I've never met anyone who has. Magic in Skyrim is always a supplementary facet of a playstyle, never the cornerstone. If you've played a full mage in unmodded Skyrim and had fun with the playthrough, please let me know because I've tried and failed several times. And I do need to express my immense displeasure with clairvoyance. I mean, has anyone ever said that the quest marker wasn't enough? I want to meet this person and have a conversation with them because they sound fascinating, if maybe for all the wrong reasons. A vast majority of the spell effects and enchantments for which I used a lot of words were the ones that did things that can't be accomplished by non-magical means. The magic that is the most interesting is the magic that isn't just statistical bonuses or malices. The thing that makes magic special is that it changes the way you can play the game. It gives you options that you wouldn't otherwise have. It lets you solve problems in new ways. Perhaps even more interesting than that, it allows the game designer or storyteller to create new problems that couldn't have existed without it. Thus far, I've been speaking as though game designers and storytellers are different, but really, I think one of the responsibilities a game designer takes upon themselves when they decide to design a game is that they must allow for stories to be told within their game. So, not all storytellers are game designers, but I think that all game designers are, or should be, storytellers, even if indirectly. Furthermore, I think that one of the main draws of role playing games is that the story and gameplay is inextricably linked. You cannot have one without the other. While different people refer to focus on different aspects of role playing games, some liking the game mechanics more, others the storytelling, most people want a combination of the two and appreciate both, acknowledging that the experience as a whole would be lesser without one or the other. Many times throughout the video, I made reference to game balance. The very first time I did, I said that my preferred way to balance magic in a video game wasn't by numbers, but by vibes. Magic needs to feel good, it needs to feel magical, it needs to feel unique, it needs to feel like you've worked for it somehow. Magic needs to feel powerful, at least eventually, and with great power comes great personal cost. Otherwise, it isn't interesting. As I said when discussing the Disintegrate spell effect and Power Word Kill from AD&D 2nd Edition, I think that magic at high levels needs to feel powerful, perhaps even overpowered. A high-level spellcaster should feel like they have more power than any person should ever have. Back to the definition of magic I gave, a high-level spellcaster should be able to reshape reality through their will. I also said that this should be a reward for getting a spellcaster to a high level. Traditionally, in fantasy, spellcasters are pretty weak and feeble. I don't think that a spellcaster needs to be that, but I do think that learning magic needs to come at a cost, even if that cost is simply being unable to study other fields. Getting a character who is learning magic to a high level should be sort of a struggle, more so than a character who is a fighter type or thief type character anyway. But because of that struggle, that risk, the reward should be higher, and this is where the true power of magic can come in. Not only should magic be able to accomplish things that can be accomplished via non-magical means, dealing damage or making you more physically resilient, it should have utility that is otherwise unattainable. In broad strokes, the possibilities are endless, but remember that there should be rules that govern magic, and not everything can be possible in the same world. What is possible in one world is impossible in another. What is simple in one world is a Herculean feat in another. Teleportation is an incredible example of something which cannot be achieved by non-magical means, at least taking Clarke's third law into account. And this is why I find the teleportation so particularly fascinating in Daggerfall. As I said, the ramifications of the Travelers League, the subfaction of the Mages Guild that provides the teleportation service, are great and many. And I think that Daggerfall doesn't explore those at all, unfortunately. I can't blame the game for that. That's a wild thing to think about. However, I think that a setting, game or otherwise, should consider those ramifications. Mournhold, the city in the Tribunal expansion of Morrowind, and all of Oblivion don't have the levitation spell effect. I mentioned earlier that I believe that the game designers designed the world first and only later realized that the worlds didn't work with levitation, so they removed the effect. If you want to create a world with magic in it and you want to take it seriously, I think that you need to start with the magic. The existence of magic has real implications and the world will be shaped by it. And if this world is going to be the setting of a game, you need to understand, at least in broad strokes, how the players are going to be able to interact with this world. and the potential consequences of them doing so. Morrowind had levitation already before the Tribunal expansion was released. Oblivion, on the other paw, came out with no levitation effect. Neither of these worlds work with the levitation effect, as I've said. Given that levitation was pre-existing in Morrowind, I find it very strange that Mournhold wasn't designed in such a way to accommodate levitation, and when you get to Mournhold on a character that has been making use of levitation, you feel the stark contrast, and that contrast is disappointing. I don't know if the world of Oblivion was designed before or after the development team decided to remove levitation. A quick search on the internet does seem to indicate that the levitate effect was removed for gameplay reasons, but that only implies that it was removed after the world was designed. It doesn't confirm one way or another. When it comes to making magic interesting in games, I mention spellmaking a lot. It is a means by which players can express their own creativity within a game. Not every game needs to prioritize player choice, but those that do, and do it well, are often lauded as being some of the most wonderful experiences in all of gaming. We've discussed problems with these sorts of systems, namely balance concerns and players getting into circumstances unforeseen by the developers. Those are both problems, and there will never be a game that doesn't have those. But the point of offering something like spellmaking is to increase player choice. I think that if you're going to design a game and you want to center player choice as a core tenet of game design, you are opening yourself up for the players getting themselves into situations you could never have predicted as the creator of the game. And that is a concern. As a game designer, you want your players to have a good time, and you want them to be in a position where they can appreciate the game you are presenting to them. If players go so far beyond the bounds of what you've anticipated, who knows if they'll be able to do that? As someone who is making a game, it can be scary to allow that possibility. But if you want to make a game where player choice is important, you have to let your players have the ability to get themselves into bad situations. There comes a time when the training wheels have to come off. If your players are able to use spellmaking or enchanting or any sort of system to get themselves into a situation that you couldn't have predicted, trust that they will be able to use the same system to get themselves out of that situation. At this point, I've talked quite a bit about magic in games, but I've not spoken much about the magic of games. The flavor is what makes games magical. Like I said earlier, having solid mechanics is what makes games good, but flavor is what makes them great. Earlier, I brought up the example of Magic the Gathering, and I'd like to use it as an example again. This is a video about magic, after all. Magic the Gathering is the Fortnite of trading card games. By that I of course mean it's shit. As much as it truly pains me to say it, I'm not joking when I say that. Magic the Gathering was my favorite game of all time. Some of my fondest memories are of that game. Magic has incredible mechanics that offer intricate, complex gameplay that I genuinely believe is unparalleled in card games, board games, tabletop role-playing games, and video games. And Magic used to have incredible flavor. The multiverse of Magic was an incredible place to explore. It had so much wonder, so much whimsy, so many dark places, so many characters to love and to hate. The story of Magic was long. It was at times convoluted and confusing, but it was rich. And it was wonderful. Kamigawa, Lorwyn, Mirrodin, Wrath, Dominaria, Alara, Ravnica, Zendikar, Innistrad, and who could forget Segovia, my beloved? All places we've been, some too often, others not often enough. Kamal, Miri, Squee, Lord Windgrace, Limdul, Commodore Guff, Freyalise, Sisay, Nissa, Jace, Fibblethip, Borborygmos Enraged. So many characters that we've not spent enough time with, and so many more that could have been. All of these characters that let us pretend that these shitty pieces of overpriced cardstock were more than that. It is hard to put into few words just how magical Magic the Gathering was, and I'm not going to be able to do that here. Go watch Spice 8 Rack's video on Lorwyn if you want that. I'll leave a link to that video in the description. But Magic the Gathering isn't magical anymore. It isn't magic anymore, and I'm honestly heartbroken. In recent years, Magic the Gathering has been moving away from its own intellectual property and has been incorporating others. It started with tiny little extras and has grown to the point where now half of all Magic the Gathering standard sets are not going to be Magic the Gathering anymore. We were going to get a return to Lorwyn this year in 2025, and that's been pushed back for another Marvel Comics tie-in set. With this shift, Magic the Gathering has fundamentally lost its identity and all of its flavor has evaporated. It's all gone. It's honestly absurd just how hurt I am by this. I don't know how much emotion will come through in the voiceover, but I've teared up during the writing of this section. Perhaps the worst part is that I know the people who make Magic the Gathering are still capable of making good cards with good flavor and of telling good stories. I mean, I would love to be able to love Bloomborough, but I can't. I've been burned. I put my tail on the stove, and I'm sure as hell not getting my ass near that thing again. I can't let myself get invested again. I don't begrudge those who enjoy the Universes Beyond products that Magic has released. If you like the Lord of the Rings set, or the Assassin's Creed card, or the upcoming Spider-Man stuff, that's great for you, I really mean that. But it just isn't Magic. Not to me. And that's okay, all good things don't last. Anyway, I don't want this video to just turn into another Magic is Dead video on YouTube. We have enough of those, I think, and I don't even think that's true anyway. All of this is really to illustrate a point. The flavor of Magic the Gathering is what made Magic more than just a game to me. Maybe you've sat through this video and thought that I was putting too much emphasis on the flavor and the storytelling and not enough on the mechanics. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're someone for whom the gameplay is the top priority. That's fine, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But might I suggest that maybe, just maybe, you're someone who just hasn't found the game that has the flavor that makes it more than a game to you. Anyway, I think that's the end of this story, but the story of Girl with Book isn't quite over yet, so let's go see how that story ends. All that was left to do was to go to Nulfaga, who held the key to the Mantella, which, once freed, would allow the Emperor to control the new medium through the totem. This, Girl with Book was sure, would be her greatest challenge yet, and so she set out to prepare. Girl with Book spent months training as she had been and improving her skills. Even though there was, at this point, little that could stand in the way of her arcane power, she knew that there was space to improve, that she hadn't yet reached her full potential. Her goal was nothing less than perfection. And then, after months of training, she reached it. She knew that she could go no further in her magical skills. A sense of triumph came over her, then calm, then dread. She cast her mind back to her reading of the Ogma Infinium and the truths which were revealed to her. She cast that dread aside and replaced it with her duty. Now she would go to Nulfaga and free the Mantella and be done with all of this mess. Nulfaga transported Girl with Book to Aetherius, the Mantellan crux, and she was in an infinite void of stars. There were only a few floating islands around her, and Daedra were there. She looked around more and found that there were doorways floating in the void, clearly barred by magic. She searched around the place and eventually figured out how to unbar one of the doors, which allowed her to progress. Girl with Book went through a gauntlet of several of these realms, apparently unconnected, each with their own trials to complete in order to progress, Daedra constantly accosting her. But they stood no chance, neither the Daedra nor the trials. She had over-prepared, clearly, but she would have had it no other way. She then came upon the Mantella, a massive green gem, and laid her hands upon it. A massive pulse of energy coursed through it, and her. The gem flung her back into Mundus, sending her crashing at the feet of Nulfaga once again. And it was done. So this end to the playthrough is where I learned something about the game. I was under the impression that the year and a day time limit that the totem gives you to give it to someone deserving of it was just a time limit to turn it into someone. I was incorrect. It is actually the time limit to free the Mantella and complete the main quest. I was, however, dedicated to this part of Girl with Book's story, and didn't even consider that I might run into that issue here. I ended up actually taking a long time to reach her maximum level and technically failed the main quest due to that time limit. I had to just walk over to the Mantellan Crux myself, because it is a place you can walk to, by the way, and just go through it to the end, even though clicking the Mantella at the end doesn't end the game for you if you don't have the quest for it. So technically, the story didn't actually play out the way I described. I hope y'all can forgive me my artistic flair here, or whatever it was that whole story thing was. Well, that's it. That's the video. I know it may not have seemed like it, but I really tried to not make this thing drag on for too long. I guess if I need a more proper conclusion to the video, I hope that if you're a storyteller of any sort, that you feel like you've gotten something out of the magic in Daggerfall. I think that there are a lot of interesting things to take inspiration from, even in the flawed states that many of them are in. At the end of the last video, I said that I wouldn't be doing another one of these anytime soon, and not 12 hours later I was already working on this one. I did mean it at the time, though. I've really enjoyed making these, whether people end up watching them or not, so I guess that I'll say that I'm not currently planning on making another one. If I have an idea, though, I'll probably make another one, I don't know. I want to give special thanks to Takarias, who also makes videos on YouTube, for voicing Hermaeus Mora for me, and for putting up with my mischief. I will leave a link to that channel in the description. I want to also give thanks to Nate Domi over on Twitch. They know what they did. Link in the description. I also stream on Twitch sometimes, but I probably won't put that link in the description. Y'all gotta work for that one. If you've made it this far, thanks. Like or dislike, or don't. Subscribe and ring the bell, or don't. Share the video with someone you think might be interested, but don't spam it anywhere. No one wants that. Leave a comment if you want to. If you want to leave a comment, but you can't think of what to say, then let me know if there's a game that is more than a game to you, like Magic was for me. If that doesn't work for you, then tell a little story about your favorite moment in gaming.